of you already have met Dr. Guy. If you have not, you're in for a real treat. He loves to add humor into his presentations. He's been with Perspectives for many years as our psychiatrist, and he is a wealth of knowledge, and I think that you all already know that, or else we wouldn't have a packed house. So thank you for squeezing in here, and with no further ado, Dr. Guy.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Make sure you hit play.
I'm not used to being here at 9 o'clock. Sorry, I was a little late. Okay. What I'm going to talk about today is a subject that I'm kind of passionate about. We're on the front lines in mental health, and so we're in a position to see the consequences of substance abuse. And this particular substance is obviously of great interest because it's now legal in Michigan, you know? So we're going to see a lot more consequences. Now, there are a lot of slides, and I'm not, it's not going to take as long as it might look to go through them because I'm not going through every slide in a lot of detail, but I want you, what I want you to be able to do is to know in yourselves the impact that it has on the brain, because that's what we're going to be talking about, is what impact does marijuana have on the brain. And we're going to look at it in two ways. We're going to look at, okay, what about for people over the age of 25? What does it do for those individuals for 25 and up? And also 25 and below, all right? And it's not as equivocal as the media would have you believe. According to the media, it's great. I mean, it solves a lot of problems, and if more people would smoke marijuana, we'd have a better country, okay? When it comes to evidence that it's bad, I'm going to just give you my quick overview here. If you take a look at the strength of evidence, you have poor evidence, mild evidence, moderate evidence, strong evidence, and then you have your rock-solid evidence, right? Okay, how strong is the evidence that it's bad for you? I would put it at strong. I would. Okay? And so that's different than the National Institute of Health because they were more equivocal on this. But as you go through and take a look at the research yourself, I think you'll understand why that's my position on it. And I try to very much communicate that to my patients. When you tell young people, don't do drugs, and you leave it there, you haven't really helped very much. It's bad for you. That doesn't help very much because there's a little thing called the internet that's invented, and there are lots of opposing opinions. And if you really want to believe something, you can find a whole lot of other people who will agree with you on the internet. And that causes, I don't know, sometimes I think it causes more damage than good because you can, whatever weird thing that goes to your head, you can find an audience and validate that now, okay? So with this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, so it's a real big problem when it comes to something like marijuana. My first exposure to marijuana, I remember very distinctly. I was in 8th grade, and I was going to a new school. And in order to get to school, we had to walk through a wooded area. And I remember seeing one of my classmates sitting down next to a tree as I'm going through there, and he was in my class. And I'm like, forgot his name, but, dude, you're sitting there smoking, you're going to be late for class. And he goes, I'm not going to class today. I'm spending the day with Mary Jane. And I'm like, well, where is she? And I think I was all the way to school before I realized Mary Jane meant marijuana. I put the two together, but that was the first time I had any exposure to it. And then when I was in college, Mary Jane was everywhere. Okay, but anyway, let's get into this.
Leading medical researchers are coming to the conclusion that marijuana, pot, grass, whatever you want to call it, is probably the most dangerous drug in the United States, and we haven't begun to find out all of the ill effects, but they are permanent ill effects.
All right, that's going a little bit too far, okay? And that was part of the problem is that, back in the Nixon era and even all the way up into the Reagan era, we didn't really know that much about the effects of marijuana. It's incredible. It's very humbling to look back and see what I learned in graduate school and medical school and how incomplete that was compared to what we know now. And it's humbling also to realize, wow, I thought we were like state-of-the-art back then. And if that's how bad it was, then how much more do we have to learn even, okay? Now, understanding cannabis is very complicated because of the receptor system that it interacts with. The endocannabinoid system is not simple, Okay, if you've studied glutamate or serotonin or or GABA or any of those other neurotransmitters, those guys are kindergarten compared to the endocannabinoid system. And because we did not understand that system, you know, it was based on observations, and those observations weren't necessarily scientific. So is it damaging? Yes, but that's going a bit far. And when you use hyperbole to describe it and you can't explain exactly what's wrong with it, nobody's going to listen. Okay? I mean, basically, when I remember the first president that really went off on marijuana was Nixon. And I don't know if you guys remember those TV commercials, but it made it look like it was LSD. And all people had to do was ask their friends, do you have weird LSD trips on marijuana? And most of them would say, no, that's garbage. And then you've just made yourself look stupid. Okay, so it's important to discuss, when talking about it, stay with the truth. Okay. Now, several years ago, the National Academy of Medicine put together a panel of experts to try to analyze the scientific literature and come to some kind of conclusion as to the safety of marijuana. You know, does it really have the benefits that they claim it has, and what are some of the risks based on our current literature? And here are, this is the report that they prepared, and it was published in January 2017, so not that long ago. All right, it was 468 pages. So people are waiting for this study. This is going to be finally, we have these states that are starting, the states were starting to legalize it. And so we wanted, from the scientific community, let's have some definitive answers. And so we expect, with all this new research that's gone on, we expect some more solid answers so we can maybe curtail this widespread legalization of marijuana. So what did this report do? It finally came out, and people read it, and it was about as stimulating as this article, okay? It was very disappointing, okay? All right, so they go through several of the theories that were out there as to what smoking cannabis does. And again, they were looking at smoking marijuana, not the individual components, not CBD or THC, but specifically, what are the evidence that smoking marijuana has these benefits? So, first theory, smoking pot diminishes nausea associated with chemotherapy. Their conclusion, there are no good quality randomized trials investigating this option. And I'm like, I first saw that and I'm going, wait a minute. Okay, it's pretty well established that THC actually does with nausea from chemotherapy. And so if you're calling that no good quality, what are you talking about? And then you got to think about it. They're not looking at Marinol. They're not looking at the medicine part of it. They're not looking at the pure THC. They're looking at smoking marijuana. And the problem is that in order to do, and this is going to be a problem with many of the things I'm discussing, what they're waiting for is double-blind, randomized, controlled trials like you have in a drug trial. And because that's not there, they're saying, oh, it's not very, is that fire drill? But because we don't have those randomized drug trial level studies, well, it's not very good then. It's like, okay, think about what you're asking here. All right, you really want us to get together 800 people and randomly assign half of them to smoke weed for a while, and we give them, okay, we're going to supply this, and we want you to smoke 3 or 4 joints a day, and you other guys, no, you don't get to it. And think about your chemotherapy patients. Half of them are getting, you're going to smoke, and half of them aren't, and then you're going to compare the two, and you think about it, and you're going, wait a minute. In animal, that's going to be difficult ethically. Try to get that through a review board. Okay? And see, that's why at some point we have to settle for studies that aren't exactly drug quality. This is not an FDA drug trial, and these are unethical and very often impractical to do these. And so they basically just said, well, there's no good studies to show that. All right, smoking pot diminishes pain. We have evidence for marijuana as treatment for pain, but very little is known about the efficacy, dose, routes of administration, or side effects of commonly used and commercially available cannabis products in the United States. So yes, it does help, especially certain neuropathic and cancer types of pain. It is useful for those things, but we're not sure of the dose, how much is too little, how much is too much, what's the best route of administration, transdermally, orally, inhalation, we don't have all that figured out yet. Okay, well, all right, true, we don't have all that figured out, but okay. Pot smoking is good for epilepsy. Conclusion, insufficient evidence. Now, that's confusing because CBD, which is part of marijuana, cannabidiol, actually is FDA approved for certain for people with severe epilepsy and so forth. And so that's weird, but keep in mind they're talking about smoking marijuana. That's different than taking CBD. And so, okay, all right. And the problem with doing clinical trials on smoking marijuana is that, what do you mean when you say marijuana? Do you know how many different strains there are? Okay, so if you do the study, it's only valid for that particular strain. Okay, and so again, that's an issue, and people haven't done those types of studies. Pot smoking is good for Tourette syndrome. Conclusion, limited evidence. I'm going to go out on a limb and say, no, it's not good for Tourette syndrome. Okay, no. Now, CBD is different, but when you're talking about smoking marijuana, no, I can pretty much tell you, based on what it does, and we're going to get into that, I would say very unlikely that it's going to help your Tourette's. I highly wouldn't recommend it. It would probably make it worse. Pot smoking is good for ALS, Huntington's disease, Parkinson's disease, irritable bowel syndrome, insufficient evidence for all of these. Good for dementia and glaucoma, probably not. See where this is going? It's like, so you guys, this is not very much. You spent all this time with this big report, and you're really not telling us. It's like you just said, we're not sure, we're not sure, we're not sure. We looked at all the research, and you came back with a big fat, we're not exactly sure. Thank you for that. How much money was spent on this? It's good for anxiety. They said maybe. All right, now we're going to get into that. That's a mixed bag. Mostly with the pot that's available on the street today, absolutely, positively not. Now, if you want to use the marijuana back from 1970 or 1960, that's a different story. But on the marijuana that's out there today, no way, Jose. Okay? All right, pot smoking is good for depression. They said probably not. I would say not. Okay. All right. And then in chapters 5 through 13 of the report, they asked the question, does it increase the likelihood of fatal car accidents? Yes. But how much? Unclear. We don't know the dose. We have to experiment, right? We have to give a bunch of people different doses of marijuana and see how many of them die in fatal crashes. Easy peasy. All right. Does it negatively affect employment prospects? Probably. All right. Does it reduce motivation and cognition? Probably. Does it impair academic achievement? Limited evidence. So, conclusion, we need proper studies. The illegal nature of marijuana has made rigorous human studies impossible. So we need to legalize it and just have a bunch of clinical trials where we expose people to high doses of cannabis and then compare them to the people that don't get it. And then when you do those double-blind, placebo-controlled trials, then we'll know. And then we got to do it for different doses and different strains. And after 50 years, we'll have enough data to say, we probably shouldn't have made that legal. Okay. Very good. All right. Now, the problem with a placebo-controlled trial for smoking pot, is we need to find something that smells that bad so that people don't know that they're getting placebo. Good luck with that. Okay? Good luck with that. Because, cinnamon doesn't work, holy basil doesn't work. They're going to know that I've got placebo here. How do you know? Well, just whiff, So they need to only use clients who can't have no sense of smell, in which case you might be able to get away with it. But if you have a normal human with a sense of smell, they're going to know when they get placebo. See, that's a big problem here. And so I don't know how you're going to get around that. Until we come up with a non-marijuana smelling weed, that we can use as placebo, you can't do placebo-controlled trials with marijuana. Okay? All right, and now, cigarette smoke has way more chemicals in it. Marijuana only has 500 different chemicals. 100 of them are cannabinoids. Now, a proper study, now this is when you're only looking at one chemical. This is what a proper study looks like. All right, now this is a study which I found interesting. This is on the effects of SAMe, acetylsumethionine, on depression. And it was published, I think, in 2014. And what they basically did was that they compared Lexapro to SAMe versus placebo. So 1/3 of your patients get placebo, they're all depressed. 1/3 get placebo, 1/3 get ultra high doses of SAMe. I mean, it was really 1,600 to 3,200 milligrams a day. That's a lot of SAMe and kind of expensive, okay? And then placebo. And what you see here is that within the first week, I mean, the SAMe group beats everybody, including Lexapro. So again, this is one study, but it's pretty impressive. And then basically, the primary endpoint were changes in the HAM-D score. And so in this 12-week study, even though there's a limited number of people, there's 144 people in the study, those are pretty good. I mean, it's not on the level of an actual drug trial, but this is the kind of trial where you have one substance that you're looking at compared to placebo, and you see separation. And again, when you're talking about marijuana, you have 500 substances. All right, and every strain has different substances, different rate, different percentages of those substances. So this is a hard target to study because it's not simple as just one thing. SAMe is one molecule, okay? So it makes it very easy to do studies of this nature. All right, now most of the marijuana that was, most of the studies on marijuana were performed in the 80s and early 90s. And one of the reason that those studies aren't of much value today is that people don't smoke that anymore. Okay, if you take a look, for example, at the THC to CBD ratios, they have gone up. I mean, if you go back to the 60s and everything, there was about, from the 60s all the way into the early 80s, there was like a 1-to-1 ratio of cannabidiol to THC. All right, now that ratio is, it's like 80-to-1 and something. You know, look at that trajectory. Okay, it's huge. It's a big difference. And so very little CBD and a whole lot of THC. Why are they genetically modifying the plant to raise THC? Why are they using selective breeding to raise THC? Anybody know the answer to that one?
Money.
Well, money, yeah. That's what people pay for. They want the high. They want the high. Okay. Now, when a drug gives you a high, why is it giving you a high? Is it because it's raising a particular neurotransmitter dose in your blood? Partly, but that's not it, because if you wear a fentanyl patch, after you've had it on for a day or so, you don't walk around waking up and go, oh, my fentanyl patch is still here. I'm still getting the buzz, man. No, you're not. You're not. Okay? Now, when you first put a patch on or take a narcotic, that shift from low dopamine to high dopamine, when you have a rapid shift in your dopamine levels in the nucleus accumbens, that's where you get the high from. And so when you first start using marijuana, that THC, it does result in that release of dopamine at the nucleus accumbens, and that shift is what gives you the buzz. And that doesn't last very long. Okay, and so what happens is you have to go to a higher and higher. In order to get that buzz, tolerance sets in and you go to higher and higher doses. But it doesn't last. It never lasts. You know, there is no drug that you can take and walk around constantly high, because once your dopamine levels reach that new level, the high is over. Okay? So you end up chasing your tail. But my point here is that the studies on marijuana that were performed from the mid-'80s and beyond, that was a different substance. So those studies are of little value to us today, because that's not what people are using anymore. And there are a lot of strains, and they have different colors and everything. And each one of those different, even within the strain, you're going to have variations in the percentage of cannabinoids. So that's why this is such a moving target. And so when they say, what happens is the general public, when they hear somebody like the NIH saying, inconclusive, we're not sure, may cause academic difficulties, may cause you to lose your job, may cause fatal accidents, they're like, well, the evidence isn't that strong. That's why it's so safe. And that's why we wisely legalized it. Because, there are no studies showing that it's really bad for you. I mean, they're all equivocal. So therefore, and I like it, put two and two together, hey, why not smoke it every day? I mean, you haven't proven that it's bad for you. All right. And then one of the things they said in that study, we need to study effects of cannabis on specific populations. So we need those double-blind, placebo-controlled trials with children, teenagers, pregnant women, breastfeeding mothers, older populations, and heavy cannabis users. We need to enroll all those people in those double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. And now that it's legal, we can just bring them all in and start giving our children, hey, son, would you like to be in a clinical trial? Good luck with that. All right. And also they mentioned we don't know about what is the dose response curve. All right. Now, so we want to know is, okay, if it's beneficial for something, what is the lowest dose that gives you that benefit? What is the ideal dose where you maximize the benefit? And what is the high dose whereby it's too much? Okay? So that needs to be established. Now, and also, we need to know, is the dose-response curve, is it linear or not? A linear dose-response curve means that if I double the dose, I double the effect. A nonlinear response curve means if I double the dose, the effect could go up tenfold. And that means the toxic effects as well. So doubling the dose could result in 10 times the toxicity. These are things that need to be established. So how does the method of consumption impact the therapeutic effects and the toxicity? So is vapor inhalation safer than when you eat it or absorb it through the skin? Is there some method of consumption that changes how effective it is or how toxic it is? All right. Now, again, this is kind of what I alluded to earlier. If you look back here, this is 1960. So from 1960 to the mid-80s, you take a look. This is CBD. This is the, oops, what did I do? Okay. You're going the wrong way. Okay, here we go. All right. So from 1960 to the mid-80s, there was like a 1-to-1 ratio of CBD to THC. And then this has stayed the same, but the marijuana potency has gone way, way, way up. So here we are at 2011, and notice that it's sitting at around 11. Now it's way beyond. That's like double this now, okay? So it just goes up and up and up because this is a plant that can be genetically modified and hybridized to produce maximum amount of THC, which is what people like. All right. So question is, what percent of the marijuana is THC? And so you'll see numbers like 18, 28%, 38%, and that's telling you that THC content is very, very high. So that's the percentage of the plant that is THC. Kids are vaping it now. People, I shouldn't say kids, a lot of people are vaping it. The benefit of vaping it is that you don't get the stink. And so you can do it and people don't have to know about it unless they look at your eyes, okay? So, I mean, that's kind of... Now, the thing with vaping it is that you're vaping a lot of pure THC. Now, one thing that we're going to see is that cannabidiol literally blocks many of the negative effects of THC. And that's why back in the old days, when there was a 1-to-1 ratio, it wasn't that terrible because the cannabidiol would block many of the toxic effects of THC. But now that they've bred the cannabidiol to a minuscule fraction of the THC, you're going to have a lot more toxicity. Okay? Now when they're vaping it, if they're vaping pure THC, there is no protection. And so all of the toxicity that we're going to be seeing in this slide deck is going to be fully there. And so the vaping it is actually worse than smoking it in some ways. You're not getting the carbon monoxide because, I mean, there are lots of bad things about smoking it, but you're just not getting the CBD benefits when you vape it. But that's growing big here. Okay, so the question is, well, since users know that this THC levels are so much higher and that marijuana is so potent, they're going to be smoking it a lot less to take advantage of that new high potency, right? Right. Yeah, not so. Okay, no, they're not. They're smoking a joint is a joint, and they don't take that in consideration. So the dose of THC they're just getting more stoned is what they're getting. Okay. All right. So they did admit this. In some cases, heavy cannabis use does seem to cause mental illness. As the National Academy panel declared in one of its unequivocal conclusions. Cannabis use is likely to increase the risk of developing schizophrenia and other psychoses. The higher the use, the greater the risk. So they did step out on a limb and say that, which is like very obvious and has been demonstrated time and time again. So they did admit, yep, it does, people, if you have genetic propensity for schizophrenia or a psychotic illness and you smoke marijuana, the likelihood that you're going to manifest definitely goes up. We now know also, I think it was 2018, where it was discovered that even if you don't have genetic predisposition for schizophrenia, you can develop a psychotic illness with THC. Okay? So, in countries where marijuana was legalized, have schizophrenia rates gone up? The answer is yes. Finland, they legalized it in 1993, and since they legalized it, schizophrenia rates doubled. In Denmark, they legalized it in 2000, and so far it's increased 25%. So, that really, the rates of schizophrenia are typically, they're across countries, 1% of the population. It has not been going up. So by showing it's actually increasing schizophrenia. In countries that legalize it, schizophrenia diagnoses have increased. That says something. Since 2006, hospital ER admissions for schizophrenia have increased by 50% in the United States. Now, does it contribute to violence? See, that's a lot of people, when you bring that up, and they're like, of course not. It mellows you out, man. It makes you less likely to be violent. When you're angry and upset, you smoke a joint, and it'll calm you down. So it's actually good for, if you're violent or anxious, you need to smoke a joint, right?
It just hit me, why not? And I think what really helped is some of the states went ahead on their own, and all the horror stories that people talked about didn't occur. Crime rates didn't go up. Drug abuse of, more dangerous forms of drugs did not increase.
Okay, said crime rates did not go up in states that legalized marijuana?
That's not entirely accurate.
All right, so let's take a look at that. All right, in the book, Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence, Alex Berenson is actually a writer for the New York Times. His wife is a forensic psychiatrist working at a prison, okay? And one night she came home and she was rather tired, and she said, what's going on? Well, I got these 4 patients, and all 4 of them, what they have in common is they chopped up family members. And what she was fascinated by was that they had one thing in common. They all were chronic marijuana users. And then she looked at just their prison population, and it's like, geez, they all have that. It's like, wow, that's like definitely greater than what you see outside of prison. It's huge. And so that got him to thinking, I wonder if marijuana could somehow be associated with violence. So he did a little research here. And he quotes a paper from the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, and where they did a survey of 12,000 American high school students. And in this survey, they asked them about lifestyle and things they'd done and so forth, and looked at, have you engaged in violence toward another student or family member and so forth. And what they discovered was that people that use marijuana were 3 times more likely to be aggressive against other people than people who didn't use marijuana. 3 times, a 300% increase in the likelihood that they would engage in violent behaviors. Now, if they confessed to alcohol usage, the risk of violence was 2.7 times greater. So what this suggests, and again, this is 12,000 students, what this suggests is that cannabis usage resulted in a higher rate of violence than alcohol. But that's pretty big. Okay. Now, if you take a look at violent crime in the United States from 2000 or 1995 to current, what you see is the trend, it's going down. Okay? So the average across the country is that murder and violent crimes have gone down since like the 80s. Okay? Notice that trend? Very, very, very clear there, okay? The blue line represents violence as reported by police, and the red line represents violence as reported by victims, okay? So it's going down. That's the average. Now, in Washington State, which was the first state to legalize marijuana, they legalized it in 2014. I'll tell you this right now, between 2013 and 2017, their murder and aggravated assault rates did not go down. they went up. By how much? 5%, 10%, 25, 30, or 40%? How much did they go up?
40?
40% is correct. Yes, it went up 40%. When everybody else is going down, their murder and aggravated assault went up after they legalized marijuana. Now, it doesn't prove it, but, you know, and this is an article that put a positive spin on it. Murders are up 41% in Seattle, which is not as bad as it sounds. Okay? So how could they put a positive spin on that? I said, well, we're still below the national average, so it went up, but we're still, you know, we're not as high as Detroit, so hey. All right, the point is, it went up when everyone else was going down. Y'all legalized marijuana, and people didn't apparently mellow. Okay? So is this a smoking gun? Does this prove that marijuana caused that violence? That's not. You can't prove. You can't say that it was necessarily causal. There could be other factors, and we can't rule those out. So it's suggestive, but it's quite suggestive. Cannabis use is growing. In 2006, 10% of the population used at least once a year. By 2017, it went up to 15%. Heavy users are growing pretty rapidly. In 2006, about 3 million people were reported to be heavy users. By 2017, it went up to 8 million people were daily heavy users. Okay? How addictive is marijuana? How addictive is it? Well, let's compare it to alcohol. If you drink alcohol, what is the likelihood that you're going to drink every day? It's 1 in 15. Only 1 in 15 drinkers drinks every day. Now, if you smoke marijuana, what is the likelihood that you're going to use every day? 1 in 5. 1 in 5. So, if you're using marijuana, 1 in 5, they can't help themselves. They end up using on a daily basis. So it's more, I could say it's probably more addictive than alcohol. Okay? And I didn't know that such a thing existed. You take a watermelon, hollow it out, put a bunch of blunts in it, and then suck the smoke from an open end, and you can like smoke a melon, you know? All right. Does marijuana make you relaxed, paranoid, depressed, anxious, or all of the above? What do you think? All of the above is the correct answer. Yes, yes.
Now that marijuana is legal here in Michigan, a Bloomfield Hills veterinarian says his office is seeing pets ingesting pot all too often. Now, this can lead to mood swings, seizures, and even deaths in animals if steps aren't taken right away to treat them. 7 Action News reporter Allie Hoxie with what you need to do if this happens to your pet.
Laying on the bed, really like scared, shivering, and he had wet the bed a couple times, and I said, something's wrong.
Groverman put Bosco in his car and rushed him to the vet.
He was nodding off. I honestly thought he was going to die. A lot of panic, some praying as well.
A quick diagnosis, the vet said Bosco likely ingested marijuana.
Because those dogs, you know, they grow their own, right? So it makes pit bulls paranoid, okay? So that suggests that it might cause a little paranoia, all right, you know? All right, paranoia is associated. There are a number of things that can be associated with paranoia. If you've had a family member, you know, in the dying process when they're really ill, sometimes at the end they'll become paranoid. I've seen that with family members. Youth, poverty, poor physical health, people with suicidal ideation, paranoia can be associated with that. And the use of cannabis. It's a well-known source of paranoia is marijuana usage. Okay, now what we're going to do is go over, I want you to understand what is the mechanism by which pot makes you paranoid. Okay? And what is paranoia? Unfounded fears that others are against you. Unfounded fears that they're thinking bad thoughts about you, that they're plotting against you, that they want to upset you, they want to irritate you, they want to harm you in some way. Okay? And it's not founded. You assume. All right. Now, this particular paper, I'm getting some of this data from this Freeman paper, How Cannabis Causes Paranoia. And what they basically did was they injected people with THC and took a look at what happened to them afterwards. And what the Freeman paper suggests is this is where paranoia comes in. There is a trigger. And then there are 3 things in your brain that result in paranoia. First is increased emotion. So your norepinephrine levels go up. Your fight or flight response is turned on. and you're experiencing some anxiety, worry, negative thoughts. So basically, your locus coeruleus is kicking out extra norepinephrine. At the same time, internally, you have this weird feeling. Okay? Now, where do you get this weird feeling from? Well, panic attack is kind of a weird feeling, and where you feel this intense dread, that's one form of strange feeling. If you're sick and your hormones are off, cortisol levels are elevated, or your liver is shutting down and you're experiencing lots of toxic things, that makes your brain feel strange. Your brain always tries to interpret things. And so when there is a neurochemical change in the brain, it says, why? 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 So if you're anxious and you have this change in your brain and your brain's not sure what this weird thing is, it jumps to the worst possible conclusion. Now, what makes that more likely to occur? If there is a problem with your reasoning, if your reasoning skills are reduced. So, increased fight or flight response, a strange feeling phenomena, and underfunctioning of your logical brain. That combination together results in what we call paranoia, where you interpret people who are neutral or positive, and you turn around and interpret them as hostile. Okay? Now, keep that in mind, because why is paranoia such an important thing to discuss? If you're talking about the association of cannabis and murder, or cannabis and aggravated assault, let me tell you, when you are paranoid, you are much more likely to be violent. When people with schizophrenia murder, or if you look at the overall rate, they're really no more likely to murder than people without schizophrenia. But when you look at the paranoid part of it, when they're paranoid, they are absolutely, when they're violent, that's when they're most likely to be violent. Okay? I mean, I could go through a whole lot of stories that are unnecessary, and I don't think I have time for all of them, but yeah, I've got a lot of horror stories of what happens when people with schizophrenia get paranoid and what they do to people, because they believe that you're plotting against them, that you're evil in some way, and you're out to get them. And the thing is, with marijuana, when you smoke a joint, when do you feel paranoid? Right away? No, not usually. Some people do. But most people don't. Because it's relaxing. I mean, that initial effects is very often. It's 2 hours, 3 hours later, that's when your paranoia is maximized. Okay? So you're not high anymore, because the high is only about 90 minutes. Okay? So the high is gone, and your paranoia is just getting started. Okay? All right. So the principal psychoactive constituent is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. Okay, THC. And what they did in this particular study is they administered it intravenous within 5 minutes, and then followed the patients. D'Souza is if you do any research on cannabis, D'Souza is one of the leading researchers in the world. And he basically has multiple publications here. And so he basically commented from his studies, because he injected people with pure THC, and then he noted that their paranoid symptoms, their anxiety, impaired working memory, was very similar to what you see with patients with schizophrenia. All right. So what he basically did was he took 1.5 milligrams of pure THC, well, 99.5% purity, and he put it in 10 milliliters of saline, and one group got pure saline, the other group got saline plus the THC. And so they're truly blinded. Each group, that they don't know who's getting the THC and who's getting placebo. Now there's another group that they gave the THC to, and they told them, I just gave you some THC, don't tell anybody. Okay? So you got three groups. The group that got saline only, and they don't know what they got. The group that got THC, and they don't know what they got. And the group that got THC, and they know what they got. Okay? All right. Now what they did was they looked at the IQ scores. So you're looking at verbal memory and other tests of IQ to see if it affected their cognitive functioning. And then they assessed paranoia. And they as a visual scale. Right now I feel suspicious of other people. Right now I feel that people want to harm me. Right now I feel like people want to upset me. Right now I feel like people are against me. Right now I'm thinking that others are trying to persecute me. And right now I feel like people are being hostile towards me. And so they basically checked off after their injection, do any of these apply to you? Okay? And then they outfitted them with virtual reality setup, so they're walking around with position sensors on their suit, and they're wearing virtual reality headset, and they sent them off on a shopping trip to various vendors. Now these are, they're in VR, and they're buying stuff from virtual vendors, okay? And so they're going through this trip, and now some of them are going through it, and they have saline in their system, others have THC in their system during their little shopping trip. And then afterwards, they were asked to assess the people they met in VR. So when they went to the various shopkeepers, how do you feel about those shopkeepers? Do you feel, please mark on the line how hostile you thought these people were. On a scale of 1 to 10, how hostile were they? Now, all of the characters in VR were neutral. Anybody who's not high could see right away these are all, they're neutral. They're neither hostile nor particularly friendly. They're neutral, okay? And so they were asked to assess that. And they were given 4 other tests, like on the PAN score and so forth. They were to look for symptoms of paranoia and increased anxiety and so forth. So they used the CAPE scale, the Community Assessment of Psychic Experiences, the PAN subscale, and then the State Social Paranoia scale. So that's what they did. And what they discovered was this. For the people that were on placebo, there was no paranoia. It was nothing, okay? They got the saline. They saw all of the characters as neutral. If they got an injection of THC, there was a significant difference. So here we are. Here's where people are on saline. Here's where people are if they got 1.5 milligrams of THC. Now, if they were told that they were getting THC, boom! Okay? So obviously, being told that you're getting THC played a big role. I mean, I was surprised by that. I thought if they were told, they would know to not be paranoid. So it's just the drug. And I thought, okay, they're going to be like placebo because you know what you're getting. But no, they got the THC and they made them paranoid, obviously. Okay. All right, so conclusion, this study establishes that THC causes paranoia in vulnerable individuals. It also demonstrated that there were several anomalous experiences, anxiety, worry, depression, and negative thoughts about self all were noted to occur in the THC group. Okay? Now, and this is a study, I have a hard time pronouncing this guy's name, Bhattacharya, Sagnik Bhattacharya, did a study where they compared the effects of CBD to THC in the same patients. And I'm going to come back to this much later, but it was a very good study because it was a functional MRI study. And I love functional. I used to be a radiologist before I became a psychiatrist at Beaumont. And when I did my psychiatry residency, I did fellowship training in functional MRI, in functional neuroimaging. And it's really a very useful tool because it allows us to see in real time what part of the brains are affected. When you do a particular task, when you move a part of your body, when you have certain emotions, when you're exposed to certain drugs, we can see what parts of the brain are active. Now, you do have to get into an MRI machine, and that's not terribly relaxing for a lot of people, but then we can give you various tasks and see what's going on in your brain. And so I'll get back to that. So anyway, I mentioned the paranoia that was caused by the injection of THC, and I mentioned at 1.5 hours, this is where your high is leaving you. But at 2 hours, this is your peak paranoid time. And then 3 hours, it drops down here. But at 2 hours, this is when people, after the high is over, this is when you are most likely to experience your maximum paranoia. All right. And anxiety is a little bit different. Anxiety does peak at 2 hours, but notice 3 hours later, your anxiety is still there. So the anxiety does not go down very quickly at all. So again, keep in mind, they smoked their joint, the fun part has been over for a while, and now they are significantly more paranoid and anxious than their baseline state. And also, there's something called the VAMS tranquilizing subscale. How tranquil do you feel? Now, keep in this, in Bhattacharya, you're comparing CBD to THC. So the dotted line represents CBD. And so what happens is that when they were injected with CBD, their maximum tranquility occurred 2 hours later. So CBD was tranquilizing. Okay? THC, however, was untranquilizing, which is duh. Okay? Kind of knew that was going to happen. All right. Now, what parts of the brain are activated? When you inject with THC, what does it do to various parts of your brain? Well, this right here is looking at the frontal brain, the prefrontal cortex. What takes place in the prefrontal cortex? You got your dorsolateral, ventrolateral, anterior, and medial prefrontal cortices. They work together to give you executive functions, planning, organization, time management, focus of attention, memory recall, mood regulation, all up front. Those are your executive functions. The higher those work, the happier your mood, the better your problem-solving skills, right? Okay. What does THC do? When THC was injected, it reduced brain activity in the front part of the brain. And this is seen with every study they've looked at. When you give people THC, it causes the prefrontal cortex to kind of go offline. It reduces activity in your logical brain, which later on, when we see what effects it has on IQ, that helps to explain that. Your problem-solving brain has become less functional. Now, CBD, on the other hand, increased activity in that part of the brain. So see what I mean about them having opposite effects? CBD improves cognition. THC reduces cognition, or the parts of the brain that are associated with cognition. Okay? All right, now the amygdala. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the amygdala. The emotional capital of your brain. Anytime you're walking around minding your own business and you perceive a change in the environment, your amygdala has to say something about it, okay? You walk in the office, you see a piece of paper on the floor, okay? And first reaction is, oh, I got to reach down and pick it up. Oh, and your amygdala goes 10 out of 10. Oh, this is terrible. My day is ruined already. Okay? And so what happens then is your logical brain assesses the threat. It says, it's not a big deal, come on. This will be over in seconds. And so what happens is your logical brain assesses the threat, and then through the uncinate fasciculus, it has a connection directly into the amygdala to quiet it down, okay? And so you don't feel the 10 out of 10 negativity. You don't feel that because within microseconds, your logical brain sums that data up, and it actually, through the uncinate fasciculus, it calms the amygdala down. Okay? Okay, Miss Dunn, we'll slide you in here, scan your brain, and see if we can find out why you've been having these spells of claustrophobia. If you've ever had an MRI scan, I was a radiologist, and I put a lot of people in an MRI machine and never thought anything about it till I wrecked my shoulder in a foot race. And they put me in that thing, and my goodness, I experienced claustrophobia. I never knew I had that, but boy, I'm thinking, if the power went out, I can't get out of here. Kind of scary. So when you're scanning people's brain, it's amazing that your amygdala will ever shut off, because that's a scary situation, So anyway, what they did was they took a look at amygdala. So you can't see the crosshairs here. That tells you you're measuring activity. And so what does THC do to the amygdala? Jacks it up, just what you expect. Your amygdala activation goes up. And what does CBD do? It reduces it. And so when you ask, can CBD be used for anxiety? I mean, well, we can't say that. It's not FDA approved for that at this point. But the evidence is kind of looking positive here. It's kind of looking positive. All right, but THC, no, I don't think so. Okay. All right, now the thing is that the cannabis, the CB1 receptors. See, in the brain you have cannabis 1 receptors, and then in other parts of the body you've got cannabis 2 receptors. I'm not going to spend much time on CB2 because it's a huge area. There's just too much. But CB1 is in your brain, and various parts of your brain have heavy concentrations. Now, the two really important areas are the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens, okay? Now, in the cannabis 1 receptor activation in the amygdala causes sustained activity. So kind of because what it does, when you activate cannabis 1 receptors, it potentiates the release of dopamine. And dopamine release in the amygdala, what does that do? When you see a patient that's psychotic, and if you're able to do imaging on them while they're hallucinating or while they're delusional, what do you see on the amygdala? It's red hot. It's red hot. fact, the very first study that demonstrated that marijuana was associated with amygdala hyperactivation was done, I think it was done in the 90s. It was by accident. They were doing a trial of functional MRI, and they had volunteers. And so they were having one group with a particular mental illness and another control group. And so they were doing a 20-year-old guy, and he was in the machine, and so they were mapping his brain to show this is a control normal, and they were going to compare that with the people who had the illness, right? So they broke for lunch, and they came back to finish the study. Well, the kid got in the scanner, and they turned it on and everything, and suddenly his amygdala is glowing like the sun. And I'm like, what happened? It was fine a half hour ago. What the heck? And so they asked, they pulled him out and said, what did you do? He says, what do you mean? What did you do? I went outside and had a joint, man, And that was the first time. That's how we discovered that marijuana excites the amygdala like that. Okay, so that's kind of what happens here. All right? This is why it took so long to figure out what marijuana was doing. This is why it doesn't work like norepinephrine or dopamine or serotonin. In those neurotransmitters, these are manufactured in the presynaptic neuron and then released across a cleft to then bind to the postsynaptic neuron. Right? This is endocannabinoid system is very different. In the endocannabinoid system, a lipid precursor in the plasma membrane of the postsynaptic membrane is enzymatically turned into anandamide. That is your natural marijuana. Okay, anandamide is the ligand that THC is copying. Okay, so that's what's supposed to be in your head. So it's produced, and how much do you produce? How much do you need? You only produce what you need. It floats in the opposite direction, binds to the CB1 receptor on the presynaptic neuron, and when that's activated, it potentiates the release of your neurotransmitter. So in the case of dopamine, what you're doing is you're enhancing the release of dopamine here, and that's why in the amygdala, when you activate the CB1 receptor, because you're bypassing this. When you smoke a joint, you're bypassing natural and you're actually turning it off. You're deactivating anandamide release, and it jumps on CB1 receptor and activates it, so you get massive release of dopamine, and that's where the anxiety and paranoia come from. Okay? All right, so what about those studies that says marijuana helps you cure anxiety? Now, I just showed you a study where they inject people with THC, and you go and look at the brain, and the amygdala is red hot. There are studies that show that when you give people THC, it calms the amygdala down. So that's confusing, right? Here's one of those studies. It was done by Luan Fan, and this was published in 2008. And what they did here was they gave people 7.5 milligrams of oral dronabinol, which is THC, okay? And then they scanned the brains. And what they found here was that placebo had hotter amygdalas than the THC group. And therefore, in this particular case, the THC calmed amygdala activation. Okay? Well, what's up with that? Why the difference? Why the disparity? It has to do with the dose. 7.5 milligrams of oral is much less than 1.5 milligrams IV. Okay? Because once it goes through the digestive tract and everything, you're going to lose a whole lot. You're going to lose a lot on first pass metabolizing, and so it's a much different dose. And so basically, in the studies where you use a dose of THC that is 10 milligrams or higher, that's when you see activation of the amygdala. At the lower doses, it calms it. So again, in the joints from the early 80s and backwards, you're not going to see this amygdala activation following that logic, because back in those days, you've only got about 5 milligrams of THC. Okay? So, how do you get to 7.5? You take a 5 and a 2.5 of your dronabinol. And why do we have these pills? I've actually prescribed these to patients before. When I was working in a tertiary care center, you have a patient who has severe nausea from their chemotherapy. I've given it before. Most of my patients became paranoid and they couldn't keep taking it, but occasionally it would help. Or you have people with cancer and they have cachexia and they have no appetite, and I've tried everything else. And, but usually when you get to that point, nothing works. I mean, the fact is, rarely is that successful. Once you start dying and your appetite goes, It's really hard to get people to eat. They have no appetite for it. They don't want to. So in that FON study, they said, we found that THC significantly reduced amygdala reactivity. Because what they did was that they gave them their 7.5 milligrams of dronabinol, and then they showed them scary faces. And then they measured their amygdala. And so what they basically said was that people on placebo were more scared of the faces than people on the THC. But again, that's at the 7.5 milligram dose. So how much THC in the average joint from 2018? All right, now I mentioned in 1970 or 1980, it's about 5 milligrams. So what is it? What's the average for 2018? Well, if you lost half of the THC due to burning and you had a gram of 18% THC, the cannabis that you consume is about 90 milligrams. Okay? So you see why those early studies aren't very helpful? You know, so even though we have all this literature on marijuana smoking, that stuff from the mid-80s and below is worthless to us because people aren't smoking that. Okay? There's a big difference between 5 milligrams and 90 milligrams. As I mentioned, 10 milligrams is when your amygdala starts to heat up. Okay? So 90 is slightly higher than that. All right. So if you were to go back in time and say, hey, you know, I see that joint, this is a joint from 1965. How big would this joint have to be to match one joint from today? Bigger than that. Bigger than that one. Okay? So, yeah. You know, I mean, 90 milligrams is pretty easy to come by. I mean, with the potency of today's marijuana, it's not that difficult to get 90 milligrams. Now, why would anybody want all that? It's way more than you need. Okay. So why are people smoking that?
Pure. It's pure, it's stronger.
Yeah. There you go. You know, what happens is when you first start out, you can get a buzz from something as low as 5 milligrams, okay? You can. But you're a beginner. And then tolerance kicks in. And so before, 5 milligrams doesn't cut it. Now you're at 10. And after a while, that doesn't cut it. So now we're at 25. And pretty soon, you're up to 90 because you can't get a buzz with less than that. Right? And that's how people end up becoming daily smokers. Keep in mind, the pleasure part comes from the difference between what is your baseline dopamine levels and the change. And this stuff stays in your, we're going to see later, this stuff stays in your system a long time, a very long time. And so trying to get that that change is very hard. So you have to keep going to stronger and stronger doses. And so you have, it's not that weird for people to come in and I ask them, and I always try to ask them in a value neutral way, you know, how much marijuana are you smoking? You know, I mean, you don't want to let them know that it's not cool, you know. So, you know, so how much? You know, and I go like this: bowls, bongs, blunts, vapor, whatever. You know, what are you doing? And they usually tell you, you know, because it's legal and you know it's no big deal. Oh, you know, 3 or 4 blunts a day. Oh, really? Okay, I'm coming back to that in a minute. All right, yes, because that's a lot of. By today's potency standard, that is hundreds of milligrams of THC. Okay? All right. Now, in D'Souza, he did a study here where he looked at, okay, he's trying to expose people to a dose of THC that is more comparable to today's marijuana. And so what he did here was he injected them with 5 milligrams of intravenous THC. So that's a pretty good sized dose. That's kind of a true joint's worth, all right? And and then basically he was assessing, you know, listening to some of their comments, and again, he's looking at paranoia. And these are some of the comments that people made once they got that dose, which again is closer to today's joint. These are some of the quotes the subject made. I thought you could read my mind, that's why I didn't answer. Or I thought you were trying to trick me by changing the rules of the test to make me flunk. I thought you were turning the clock back to confuse me. I could hear someone typing on the computer and I thought you were all trying to program me. I felt as if my mind was nude. I thought you were all giving me THC through the blood pressure machine and the sheets. Okay, so these represent increased suspiciousness or loss of insight. And then I thought that let's see, I thought that this was real. I was convinced this wasn't an experiment. And then conceptual disorganization. I couldn't keep track of my thoughts. They'd suddenly disappear. Grandiosity. I felt I could see into the future. I thought I was God. Or inability to filter out background signals. The air conditioning that I couldn't hear before suddenly became deafening. I thought I could hear the dripping of the IV, and it was louder than your voice. And so just some ideas, the perceptual changes that took place with this dose. All right. And so this is where the IQ testing came in. And what we see here are the same individuals. The top, this is without any THC injection, okay, with no baseline state. And they do the Hopkins verbal learning test. And so these are the scores there. And what we see is that, okay, this is at 2.5 milligrams of IV THC. This is at the full 5 milligram dose. So the higher the dose, the lower the cognitive functioning. Okay? Just showing a dose-response relationship. All right. Now, what also happens is, okay, when you activate the amygdala, okay, that's the heart of your fight or flight response. So when you turn the amygdala on like that, you've turned on fight or flight, so your cortisol gets jacked up. So as long as that is elevated, as long as that baby is stimulated, you're walking around with elevated plasma cortisol levels. So here we have the THC infusion, and again, the higher the dose, the higher the cortisol. Okay? Now, what's wrong with that? So you have a little extra cortisol. Well, what's the worst that could happen, right? You know what I mean? Extra cortisol leads to a lot of problems, and that's another 2-hour talk right there. But you don't want your cortisol levels elevated. You do not want that at all. If you want to have a good, happy life, you don't want that. Okay? And I'm not going to go into the mechanism, this specific mechanism, because it's way too complex. But you get the idea. Okay? With regard to schizophrenia, you know, they mentioned in that report that it does increase risk of mental illness, and specifically they mentioned something about schizophrenia. Schizophrenia incidence, as I said earlier, is about 1 in 100. So whatever country you go to, it's pretty much the same. 1 in 100 have schizophrenia, and that's another lecture as to where that comes from, which is a good one. One of my favorite topics too, but I'm not going to talk about it right now, but just for now, 1 in 100. If you smoke marijuana casually, if you just confess to being a marijuana smoker, the risk doubles to 2 in 100 or 1 in 50. Okay? Now, what if you smoke the strong stuff, which is if you smoke frequently, like a daily user, 4 times a week, or really high potency stuff, let's say you're using vapor, or you're smoking blunts. Now it's 6 out of 100. So your risk has gone up 600%. If you smoke blunts, your risk of schizophrenia has increased by 600%. What if you have a first-degree relative that has schizophrenia? A parent, a sibling. Now it's 1 in 5. So you go from 1 in 100 to a risk of 1 in 5 if you smoke marijuana and you have a first-degree relative with schizophrenia. So, does it cause schizophrenia? In susceptible individuals, yes, it does. Okay? It causes psychotic illness even in people who don't have it, and that's something relatively recent. Now, the question is, one of the observations, and this it's not canon yet, but it is an observation that many psychiatrists are noting, is that, in fact, there is actually a study looking at this as well. If you develop psychotic symptoms and you don't have a family history of schizophrenia, and you develop psychotic symptoms after smoking a bunch of blunts or using vapor, the psychosis you develop is much more difficult to treat than actual schizophrenia. Okay? Now, we don't know exactly why that is. One theory is that THC is neurotoxic, and the oxidative damage and the direct neurotoxic effects are very severe. And so trying to get a handle, there's one study out there where they try to use Haldol to treat those symptoms, and the patient's symptoms actually got worse with antipsychotics. Not only did it not successfully treat their positive symptoms, the delusions, the hallucinations, the disorders thinking, they actually got worse. So that's something, now again, we're just at the beginning of making this observation, so we're not done with this yet, but it is kind of serious here, okay? All right, now the long-term effects of marijuana on the brain. What are those? This study here was done by Filber, okay? And what they did here was they took individuals that smoked marijuana for 20, 30 years, and some of these individuals smoked cigarettes as well, or used alcohol as well, or other substances. And then some of these individuals just smoked marijuana for 10, 20, 30 years. And then the other group was totally clean. And so they matched them demographically, they matched them age, sex, socioeconomic status, and so forth. And then what they did was they compared the brains of the control group, the people that smoked for 10, 20, 30 years, plus drank and everything else, and then the people that just used marijuana for 10, 20, 30 years. And then they did some comparisons. They want to know what are the structural differences in the brains between these three groups. All right, so this is the demographics right here. Here's your control. There were 62 people in the control group, 48 in the cannabis users that also use cigarettes and alcohol, and then 27 people who they were clean from all other substances, just used cannabis, okay? And these individuals were pretty much daily users, okay? Now what's interesting is these people look similar with regard to their race and age and sex. However, there's one area that's different. The people that smoked marijuana had a little bit, about 1 year more education than the non-cannabis smokers. So the weed smokers were slightly better educated, okay? However, the IQ was significantly lower in the weed smokers than the general population people. We have 111 in the non-smokers, 105.8, and 104 here. Okay? So that's the first observation we make, is that even though the weed smokers were better educated, they had significantly lower IQs. Now, they measured brain here, and you're looking at both the volume of brain tissue and the activity of the brain tissue. And they compared the two groups, and what we see is significant reduction of the gray matter volume in the bilateral orbital frontal cortexes here, or your orbital meatal prefrontal cortex. This is a very important part of your brain with regard to a lot of things, including mood regulation and self-control, for example. So the people that use marijuana had significant volume reductions in the orbital frontal cortex. All right? Now, the other thing that was different is that, okay, there's a particular white matter pathway that I alluded to earlier, and it connects the orbital meatal prefrontal cortex, or the orbitofrontal cortex, and the amygdala. That's called the uncinate fasciculus. And we can do tractography or diffusion tensor imaging and look at the health of that pathway and the width of the pathway. Do you have, how thick is that fiber bundle? And what we see in comparing these two groups is that the group that smoked marijuana had significant reductions in that fasciculus. Okay? Now, the orbital frontal cortex is smaller, but that little bit that's there is trying to do the job. And so actually it's burning a little hotter than the people who didn't smoke marijuana. But there's not a lot of volume there. And the cord that connects the logical brain to the emotional brain, the cord is thinner. All right? So, and also they looked at connectivity between these groups. Basically what I mentioned earlier was that the resting, even though the orbital frontal cortex is smaller, it's trying to do its job, and so it's running hotter, but it's not able to calm the amygdala very well, okay? The amygdala is still burning hot because it can't seem to calm it down, okay? Now, why is the uncinate fasciculus not working very well? And this is really important here, okay? And that's because, I'll give you the answer right now. It's because cannabis appears to have neurotoxic effects on brain tissue, okay? It's kind of redundant to say it that way, but it's kind of poisonous to nerve, okay? How so? How do you know if nerves are being damaged? Well, one way is to cut a person open, do a brain biopsy, but it's hard to get volunteers for that. So we have a non-invasive way of looking at the health of the neurons in your brain. And we can do that through functional MRI, and there's a procedure called diffusion tensor imaging. Diffusion tensor imaging measures fractional anisotropy of your nerve cells in your brain. Now, what is fractional anisotropy? Well, let me explain it this way. Here, this big yellow thing is a neuron inside your brain, okay? Now, the neuron, you have the plasma, you have the myelin sheath, which is like a rubber coating, and that allows saltatory conduction or electrical conduction through the nerve, so you can go from point A to point B. Is there water inside a nerve? Of course. And so inside this myelin sheath, which is kind of waterproof, but not 100%, you have water flowing through the nerve as well, okay? Now, in a healthy nerve, most of that water, 99.99%, stays within the myelin sheath, and a little bit will diffuse out through teensy-weensy pores, okay? Now, this is called, axial diffusion. This is called radial diffusion, okay? So radial diffusion is when water is leaking through the myelin sheath out of the nerve. Healthy nerves have little radial diffusion and lots of axial diffusion. Does that make sense? So when you do diffusion tensor imaging, what you're measuring is how much radial diffusion is taking place. How leaky is that nerve? People with diabetes, and one of the reasons that diabetes is so devastating for our psychiatric patients, and the reason that if you have diabetes and depression, your depression is going to be doubled because of the damage that diabetes does to the brain. When you do diffusion tensor imaging, you see increased radial diffusion. And that's when we do diffusion tensor imaging, again, measures fractional anisotropy. When fractional anisotropy goes down, radial diffusion goes up. And so you end up with leaky nerves. Leaky nerves. And same thing you see with multiple sclerosis. So diabetes, multiple sclerosis, all of these increase radial diffusion inside the nerve. Okay? So they did diffusion tensor imaging on your chronic marijuana users versus your control groups. And was there a difference with regard to radial diffusion? Yes, there was a difference. And what's interesting is this. The more years of usage, the lower the fractional anisotropy. In other words, the more years you use, the higher the radial diffusion. So for every decade that you're smoking marijuana, your nerves become more leaky. So for those individuals who had 10 years of chronic marijuana usage, this was how diffusible your nerves were. But if it's 16 years or 36 years, the longer the use, the more damaged the nerves. Okay? Now, can you prove that THC caused that? Because you're like, man, that's a smoking gun right there. What more do you need to see, right? Can't we just present this data and say, look, THC or marijuana usage is clearly neurotoxic. What more do we need? You'd think that would be conclusive evidence. It's not conclusive. Why not? Because how do you know that people with lower IQs and more damaged brains are not more likely to smoke marijuana? That sounds kind of crazy. But if you think about it, we know for a fact that people who have lower education are more likely to smoke. The lower your socioeconomic status, the lower your education, the more likely you are to smoke. So is something like that going on where you're looking at this brain damage here, but maybe these people, they had it all along. And these are the people that choose to smoke marijuana because their brains don't function very well. Yeah?
Does that have to do with the development of the brain, 25 and older, 25 and younger?
Yeah, these are individuals that they've been smoking. It's just it didn't separate out as to what age they started. It just looked at the number of years of use. We're going to get to that part later on, though. Okay? All right.
What was the educational difference in that one subgroup?
It's about 1 year. About 1 year difference.
So are we saying high school versus like associate's degree? Are we talking about?
Yeah, exactly. The number of years. Yeah, basically the number of years. So 12th grade, 11th grade, 1-year college, 2-year college, like that. How many years of education did you have? Okay, so the marijuana smokers had about 1 year more education on average than the non-marijuana smokers. Okay? All right. So again, the lower the socioeconomic status, the lower the education, the higher the likelihood of smoking. And so again, is something like that going on here? What would a study look like that would be unequivocal? If you wanted to know, I don't want any argument. How do we prove that it was the marijuana that caused the brain damage and not people starting out with brain damage? How can we prove that? Well, very simple study. All we have to do is take about 500 non-pot smoking volunteers who don't use drugs, scan their brains, do diffusion tensor imaging, administer IQ tests, quantify brain volumes, and ensure that you have a homogeneous population, right? Now, you separate them into 2 groups of 250, and one group, we force them to smoke 2 joints a day for 30 years. And the other group, they don't, okay? There you go. And then you compare the brains later. And now we can say, y'all started out the same. You were one homogeneous population. The group that smoked weed, now we can say, look at the difference. See the pot brain and the normal brain. Ta-da! Now we can say, yes, we can say unequivocally that the marijuana caused the damage. You see the difficulty with a study like that? Okay? All right. Now, typically, your IQ goes, if once you get out of high school, if you watch TV every day and don't do anything else, your brain will deteriorate. I mean, you got to have some stimulation. Normally what happens is your IQ goes up. While your processing speed goes down after 25, your general IQ continues to climb until you're about 65. Okay, if you continue to learn, the general trend is your IQ goes up until you get about here, and then it starts to go whoop, 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 which I'm not too crazy about, but that's what happens. Okay? All right? All right, so that's what happens to normal people. Your IQ climbs. If you look at, your 18-year-old self is considerably dumber than your 35-year-old self. Your IQ should go up, up, up. Okay, that's what's supposed to happen, and that's what happens to the average human. However, if somebody starts smoking marijuana before the age of 18, and they're smoking regularly before the age of 18, then what happens is the opposite. Their IQ actually drops between 18 and 34 years old. Okay? Or, I'm sorry, between 18 and 38. Now, if you have a psychiatric diagnosis, your IQ drops even further. If you have 2 psychiatric diagnoses, it drops even further. And if you've got 3, then woo, okay? It affects your, so marijuana plus just marijuana alone drops your IQ. From 18 to 38, the IQs go down, which I think is interesting, considering everyone else's IQ goes up, okay? Not everyone else. I mean, obviously, crack cocaine, alcohol, and I'm sure other things do it as well, but anyway. All right, so heavy cannabis, early cannabis use associated with decreased likelihood of school completion, increased likelihood of later cannabis use, increased likelihood of use of other substances, and increased likelihood of suicide attempts. All right, so now, what about for individuals specifically under the age of 25? And this is a special category because for these folks, the news is really bad. I mean, what we talked about so far is, okay, if you're over the age of 25 and you smoke marijuana, what do you have to look forward to? It makes you more paranoid. It's going to, bless you, it's going to affect your verbal memory and IQ performance. And so your brain is not going to, your logical brain is not going to work very well. You're more likely to be paranoid, depressed, anxious. So the immediate effects might give you a little whoopee there, but after that 90 minutes are gone, you're going to look forward to some paranoia and anxiety, which will affect your relationships, by the way. Okay? You start to becoming, when you become less tolerant, when you're getting more paranoid and more anxious, you are less tolerant of other people's mistakes. Okay? You see them as more, you screwed up again. You're trying to irritate me, aren't you? Okay? And so if you throw alcohol into the mix as well, you see where domestic violence can become an issue. And so now, neurodegeneration. So you want to smoke every day, your IQ is going to go down. I mean, that's what you have to look forward to. It's going to affect your intelligence. I remember one study that I didn't quote in here, but I talk about to patients all the time, showing that chronic long-term use reduces the volume of your hippocampus and amygdala by about 1% per year. Okay, and so when you couple that with what we see about the neurodegenerative changes, and you're talking about shrinking your brain. All right, so you are using a substance that is progressively making you less yourself. Your brain is becoming an organ that is it is not functioning up to par, and it's getting worse and worse. So that's the news for adults. For children, it is far, far worse. For people, see, your brain continues to mature up until you're 25 years old. Then you're truly an adult, because now your brain is completely myelinated. It myelinates from back to front. It is the development of your brain is not complete until 25, and then you are the finished product. If something interferes with that maturational process, it is possible to get locked into an immature state. All right? So let's start with this. What about cannabis use by pregnant women? Now, common sense tells you probably not a good idea, all right? But it's practiced a lot. Why were pregnant women smoking marijuana? Morning sickness. It does help with nausea. However, what it's doing to the kid is bad. Okay, I mean, duh, all right. You don't want your kid smoking weed, okay? It's just not a good idea. Okay. All right, why is that? Okay, I mentioned anandamide. Anandamide is your natural endocannabinoid that is produced by the hypothalamus. And what it does is it directs the maturation of the brain. It has a role in prenatal neural development. And so it helps with neurogenesis. It helps take that immature neuron and tells it, okay, in order for this neuron 5285C, you have to connect to 4862X. And so you need to grow your axon from point A to point B over here. Well, all these all these blueprints are coordinated by the endocannabinoid system. They tell the nerves where to go and then who to touch. Okay, so migration, differentiation, synaptogenesis, each neuron has between 5,000 and 11,000 synapses to other neurons. Who directs those? The endocannabinoid system. The endocannabinoid system is essential for brain development and maturation. It does a lot of fine-tuning. Fine-tuning. So if mom smokes throughout pregnancy, does the baby end up dead? That's like fine-tuning. Can you live with a not fine-tuned brain? Sure you can. It's just not optimized. It's just not, basically your brain is going, compared to what you would have achieved, you are significantly less. You have a brain that it's the basic dishwasher. I mean, it doesn't, it's the basic model. You're not getting no bells and whistles. But I didn't mean by, so I'm thinking appliances, not occupation. Okay, so I realize that. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that that your brain is very standard, but the fine-tuning things that would have made you special, that would have been you, are gone. Okay, so how can I say that? All right. Anyway. Okay. Yes, there's no nice way of saying it. Okay. It's very important for the positioning of the GABA interneurons. Okay. Why are the GABA interneurons important? Okay, what does GABA do? Anybody know what GABA aminobutyric acid, what's that good for in the brain? Is it excitatory or inhibitory? Inhibitory, exactly. So GABA interneurons are like when you have an excitatory glutamate or an excitatory dopaminergic neuron, the GABA interneurons fine-tune it so that it's not too much. So you get it just right. And that's what you want. When you're fine-tuning a brain, that's a pretty extensive piece of hardware. And those connections are critical if you want to optimize the efficiency of that computer. And so those GABA interneurons have to be placed at just the right spot so that you get that fine-tuning. And that's the endocannabinoid system. Anything interfering with this is going to result in less fine-tuning. And so when you're smoking marijuana during pregnancy, then you turn this off. How do we know that? Well, when you smoke marijuana, what happens to your anandamide levels in your cerebrospinal fluid in your brain? They turn off. Okay? Now, the normal ligand, anandamide, once you produce it, as soon as it does its job, there are enzymes to take it out of the circulation immediately. It's immediately degraded. So it comes out, does its job, and then it's chewed up, gone. With THC, do you have those enzymes? No. You smoke a joint, 15 days later, 80% still there. Okay? Turning off your endocannabinoid system, stopping brain maturation. Okay? All right, so marijuana is the most commonly used illicit drug used during pregnancy. Okay, the exact number, the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists estimate that between 2 and 5% of women use marijuana during pregnancy. Now, if they're in a socioeconomically disadvantaged group, then up to 30%, 28% are smoking weed during pregnancy. Okay, during pregnancy. So, second generation is not looking too good here, folks.
Nope.
All right. Now, this is from that National Academy report that I talked about earlier. It was published in 2017. And in Chapter 10, they discuss prenatal, perinatal, and neonatal exposure to cannabis. And basically, so what did they say about it? What are the potential side effects of marijuana use while pregnancy? While pregnant? There is substantial evidence of a statistical association between maternal cannabis smoking and lower birth weight of the offspring. Whoa. You know, anything with carbon monoxide is going to give you a lower birth weight. Okay, I mean that's just smoking anything is going to do that. So they said that, and that's like, come on, there's a lot more to it than just that. And so what about the other things? There is insufficient evidence to support or refute a statistical association between maternal cannabis smoking and later outcomes in the offspring, such as sudden infant death, cognition or academic achievement problems, or later substance abuse. And I was like, okay, what do they mean there's insufficient evidence? What kind of studies are they waiting for? Okay, you know what kind of studies they're waiting for. They're waiting to have a study where we have 250 pregnant women who smoking dope and 250 who are not, and then they have babies, and then you compare them. But you can't just be smoking marijuana. You have to randomly assign. So you have to take 500 people who do not smoke marijuana and give them marijuana and say you have to, and this group you can't, because you want to make sure it's a homogeneous group. Those are the studies that they're waiting for to say it's conclusive. But when the average person reads that, it sounds like there's no evidence that it causes damage to fetuses, which is nonsense. We have tons of every other animal we look at. Rats, rabbits, monkeys, it messes up. Their offspring end up with lower IQs, poor motor function. It causes devastating effects. And so humans are like way different though, right? Nerve cells are nerve cells. Okay? A lot of young mothers, if they're under the age of 18, there's a high incidence of people under the age of 18 smoking marijuana during pregnancy. Okay? So this is an interesting study. What they did, because, you know, again, making people smoke marijuana for a study like that is kind of unethical. So they did kind of the next best thing. What they did was they took mothers who already smoked marijuana, and they tried to match them with controls who were similar demographically to them, and then they do tractography on both the children born to women who smoked marijuana during pregnancy and compared it to the women who didn't smoke marijuana during pregnancy. And they didn't look at the women, they looked at the brains of the babies. And by tractography, what you're doing is, okay, the brain has to be wired correctly. And so, you know, your insular cortex, for example, needs to connect to the cerebellum and the fusiform gyrus and so forth. And the strength of these connections determines how well wired your brain is. So you need the right number of wires going from point A to point B, again, to optimize function. So what they want to know is, are the brains of cannabis-exposed infants different than the brains of non-cannabis exposed infants? Simple as that. Okay? So they had 20 women who smoked marijuana in combination with nicotine, alcohol, opiates, and antidepressants. Okay, so they were busy. Okay. And then you had 23 women who just exposed to all those other drugs but no marijuana. And then you have controls, which were drug-free. So 20 in the first group, 23 in the second group, and 20 in the control group. So it's kind of a small study, but what you're doing is you're scanning 60 brains here, and you're looking for differences. And what they discovered was that connectivity of the subcortical seed regions with high fetal cannabis. So they looked at the areas of the brain that have lots of cannabis 1 receptors, looking for differences in those groups. And there were specific differences in the groups between the insula and 3 striatal connections: the anterior insular cerebellum, the right caudate cerebellum, the right caudate right fusiform gyrus, left caudate cerebellum. Bottom line is that the marijuana-exposed infants had significantly lower connectivity in all of those clusters compared to the control group. Okay? So in other words, the wiring was underperformed when the mother exposed the fetus to cannabis. All right? So the right I'm not going to go into what all these parts of the brain does, because that's a lot of stuff, and so that's kind of too much. So I'm not going to go into all that. But just to say, if the brain is not wired correctly, you're going to be missing out in terms of cognitive function, total intelligence, and performance. So anyway, the anterior insula of the cerebellum is important circuitry related to empathy. And so it's not just your cognition that it's affecting your connections to other people as well. All right, so I'm not going to go through all this stuff. So, we're talking about visual spatial learning, reading, fine motor activity, even how you interpret sensory data is even affected by this. And this is just a picture of what they saw and the differences between the marijuana-exposed group and the not marijuana-exposed group. So, again, these are significant differences. Now, animal studies, we've already seen this. And so what you saw was a human study where you look at cannabis-exposed infants compared to none. When we do animal models, we see the same thing. And so this is not a new thing. With animals, though, we can randomize them. And we can have, similar group, and we can force one group of animals to inhale marijuana and the other one not. And so, when we do those, we see the damage. And so, animal models have established a causative relationship, but they're waiting for us to do those same studies in humans, and I suspect that'll never happen. Okay, you're not going to experiment on pregnant women. All right, or children. Exactly. Yes. Okay. So anyway, you get the idea. All right. In addition to guiding developing structure and organization, endogenous endocannabinoids are also important neuromodulators of presynaptic activity in the central neurotransmitter system. So it doesn't just affect the GABA system. It affects the GABA, the endocannabinoid system. It affects GABA, glutamate, norepinephrine, the endogenous opiate systems, endorphins, and enkephalins, as well as dopamine. And so, this system it's throughout the brain. It does a lot of things. So, in mammals exposed to THC in utero, if brain function was measurably significantly reduced compared to the control groups, how can it be that in humans it's okay? All right. Now, again, the question is, in the human study that we looked at, because we didn't pick out those people from the beginning and randomly assign who got the marijuana, the question comes, isn't it possible that people with mothers with poorly wired brains pass their poorly wired, their offspring have poor connections because of mothers having a defect, which is why they were smoking marijuana? We haven't proven that. And so this is where they say, well, the studies they're not unequivocal because of this. All right, so at some point, you got to think, okay, how much of this is common sense? What you're asking for is something that we can't achieve. And think about what's in the balance here. All right, so you're waiting for a study that can't be done. And so in the meantime, we give the green light to go ahead and expose an entire generation to a substance that impairs brain development. Okay? Because somebody doesn't want to throw up when they're pregnant. Okay. And again, how do we conclusively prove it? Again, you're 500 pregnant women, and half of them get to smoke marijuana. All right. So that's in utero. That's the in utero consequences or concerns. Why we definitely want to tell our patients, please don't you dare expose your kid to marijuana when you're pregnant. That is a horrible idea. Now, what about after they're born? And this is kind of, I think, the last big section. What are the effects of THC on brain maturation? Because the brain continues to mature, especially, I mean, from birth to 10 years old, massive amounts of change are taking place. And then the secondary, from 10 to 25, that's the final push. And a lot is happening there. I mean, in the adolescent years, as your brain evolves, you get greater capacity to learn and create, increased risk of damage from drugs and alcohol. Your self-control, logic circuits, as the brain myelinates and those frontal lobes come online, your ability to have empathy. First, your ability to put yourself in other people's shoes and think, if I were in your shoes, I can see your perspective. And then later on, you actually can feel, your true empathy kicks in, where you can feel the pain of others, or you can be happy for other people. These are things that happen as the brain matures, if it does so in a good way. Now, what happens during that time of adolescence is a process called competitive elimination. And when I do talk on schizophrenia, this is very important because this process goes awry in individuals with schizophrenia. But what's supposed to happen, now from birth you have so many neurons, and then by age 6 you've got extra neurons, okay? And so you got to get rid of about 500 trillion of these babies, okay? So which 500 trillion do you get rid of between the age of 10 and 25 years old? Well, the endocannabinoid system plays a role in helping you identify which ones. Which ones are you supposed to get rid of? The stuff that's obsolete. The more you use a particular pathway, the more AMPA receptors appear in the postsynaptic membrane. And so you have to identify those pathways that are AMPA poor, and those are targeted for destruction so that your brain becomes more efficient. And the endocannabinoid system plays an important role in making your brain more efficient. And while this is taking place, the myelination process is taking place. And so together, you are evolving a higher brain so that at 25, you maximize very important functions, okay? See, CB1 receptors are, the endocannabinoid system regulates glutamate, GABA, synaptic pruning, and white matter development, okay? And hence, that helps explain why you see the nerve damage with chronic cannabis usage. Because white matter, you have lots of cannabis receptors in your oligodendrocytes, okay? So, and also, when you expose yourself to marijuana, it downregulates the cannabis 1 receptors in the white matter. So fewer cannabis, so you need those receptors to cause the brain to mature, to cause the myelin to go from back to front like it's supposed to. Those cannabis 1 receptors are important. If you're smoking marijuana, you downregulate those, and you turn off the production of anandamide, which helps the brain mature as well. So using marijuana before the age of 25 stops brain maturation. It does it in animals, and it does it in humans. Now, what normally happens if you're not exposing your brain to toxic substances and you're a normal individual from the age of 10 to 25, 3 things go up. Working memory. Working memory. How much can you hold in your brain at any one time? Okay? That goes from a 10-year-old, like what, 500 megabytes or something of working memory. How much can you hold in your head over the next 3 minutes? Okay? And so, by the time you get to be 25, now you got like 3 or 4 terabytes. So big difference. Huge change in the amount of working memory. Another thing that goes up is your motivation. A 10-year-old doesn't worry about, gee, when I'm 12, am I ready? Have I prepared for being 12? Oh my gosh, and then junior high's coming up. What do I have to do now? Okay, you don't think that far in advance. You think about right now. You think about tonight and right now. You don't think about next week. You don't have motivation to do that. However, as you get closer to 16, 17, 18, you start thinking about the future you want for yourself, and you're motivated to start making some sacrifices. Okay, that goes up. Mood regulation, your ability to cheer yourself up when you're depressed or calm yourself down when you're anxious, that goes up. as you go from 10 to 25, normally. Now, if you're smoking marijuana and you expose your brain to THC, what does THC does? It drops the production of anandamide, and anandamide comes out and orchestrates the movement from point A to point B so that you go on to the next level, okay? You need that. Brain maturation is dependent on the endocannabinoid system. If you're smoking marijuana, you interfere with that system. You know, and so basically, you know, we need maturation of your nucleus accumbens, your reward center, and that prefrontal cortex is so important for impulse control, decision making, organizing, planning, attention focus, working memory. And if you block maturation in those areas, then you are left at a child level of functioning. Okay? So what are the natural ligands to arachidonoglycerol for the CB2 receptors, in the brain, the CB1 receptors? This is the main character, anandamide. And so here's, I think I got a slide to this. All right. So this is just a simple slide showing you what anandamide does. Anandamide binds to its receptor.
Very simple.
Oh, yeah, very simple.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So what anandamide? Think of it this way. Okay, you're 11-year-old, and it's time to bump you up to 11 and a half or whatever. And what happens is anandamide comes out at a very specific concentration. It is released from the postsynaptic membrane just a little bit. It binds to the CB1 receptors at a particular strength, okay, the Ki. The Ki refers to how strong a ligand binds to its receptor. So it comes out, it binds the receptor in the right place at the right time and the right strength, like playing a tune on a piano, okay? The quality of that sound depends on what it follows, what comes before, what comes after, how hard you hit the key. That makes either music or noise. Okay, so anandamide comes out, it plays its tune, and then the brain matures to the next level. Okay, all right. So like a video game. Okay, when you complete level 2, and then you do that, you come out, you play the tune the right way, you unlock level 3. In the same way, when anandamide comes out, plays this little tune, your brain gets to mature to the next level. So you go from 11 to 11 and a half. And so periodically, these pulses give rise to normal brain maturation. All right, and so what does cannabis do? What does THC do? It downregulates CB1 receptors and blocks the release of anandamide. And so you turn off that maturational process. So if you have a 13-year-old and he smokes a joint, how long is that joint going to affect his endocannabinoid system? Quite a while. For one joint, remember, 15 days later, 80% is still there. Okay? 80%. And so what you're looking potentially here is one joint blocks maturation for like a month. Okay? What if you're smoking every day? If you're smoking every day or several times a week, and you're in your teens, and you do that until you're 24, and you started at 13, at 30, guess how old you are? Your brain is still 13. Your working memory, your capacity for mood regulation, your motivation is that of a teenager. Okay? So endocannabinoid system regulates inhibition of glutamate neurotransmission, important for synaptic pruning, influencing position of GABA neurons, white matter development. We talked about that. Okay? Persistent marijuana users, as I mentioned before, is, we talked about that reduction in their IQ. Okay, now this is established here. So normally, and everyone else's IQ is going up, their IQ is going down. All right? And again, I mentioned the natural endocannabinoid, the anandamide. As soon as it is created, there are degradative enzymes to take it out of so it's not supposed to keep hanging around, because you want the endocannabinoid system to keep working, and so you only produce enough for right now to move to the next level. But THC is a foreign substance that happens to bind to those CB1 receptors, and it throws a monkey wrench in the whole system. All right? So chronic heavy cannabis use, you see reduced anandamide in the cerebrospinal fluid, reduced CB1 receptors, and abnormalities in brain regions high in CB1 receptors, and that's what we saw today. Okay? It's kind of like, you know, as opposed to a virtuoso coming out and playing the right tune and unlocking the next level, imagine a 3-year-old just banging on the keys. Does that cause maturation of anything? No, it does not. Okay? And, you know, this basically just shows you what happens to your blood levels. Okay? This right here is your THC right here, and these are the metabolites of THC, carboxylic acid. But notice 15 days later, you know, we got tons of this stuff still sitting in your brain. And that's from one cigarette, from one joint. Okay? Yeah.
I have friends that tell me that they'll eat edibles because it doesn't go to their brain.
That's kind of an oxymoron, kind of. yeah. They eat edibles because it doesn't go to their brain.
Right. So it's already gone to their brain.
Oh, they probably learned it on the internet, so it's true. Yes.
It's already gone to their brain.
Yes, it's gone to their brain. Yes. Edibles are, edibles. Isn't that what we, in the clinical trials, when we give them those pills, those are edibles. Yes. So yeah, CSF, you know, basically that natural ligand that causes the brain maturation, it goes down for people who are exposed to THC. So anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on this. Now the thing is what I try to tell my patients, you know, if you're a young person and they want to smoke marijuana, I say, look, I'm going to just be honest with you. I don't mind CBD, you know, because I don't want to come out, oh, I'm just anti-marijuana. Says, look, I have no problem with cannabidiol. I really don't. I mean, if you want to use, a lot of it's hemp. It's not even from marijuana. It's from hemp, most of it out there. And I've not seen any problem with that. So, hey, knock yourself out. I don't care. But THC, let me tell you, it's going to cost you millions of dollars in lost income. Millions. Because working memory, motivation, and mood regulation are important for well-paying jobs. Okay, if you want to have a child brain, then you can work at McDonald's, you can work at a car wash, you can do a lot of simple jobs. But if you want a job that's going to pay a lot of money, then you're going to need these things. All right, and if you get stuck with a 13-year-old brain, you're not going to be able to do these jobs. These jobs require working memory. Okay, so skilled labor jobs, college-educated jobs, you know, just a lot of these jobs, you need to have good working memory. You need to have self-motivation and so forth. You can't not show up to work. You know, you can't, you know, if you can't keep up. Your working memory is so important. A lot of jobs require you to have a very good working memory, and that is impaired, and you can't get it back. So the damage that you're doing in adolescence is not something that can be repaired. Okay, that's not coming back because you expose yourself to a toxic substance during a critical period. For the brain, adolescence is a critical period, and you can't undo the damage that's done. So, for people under the age of 25, you know, you can see why some people who smoke marijuana end up living in their parents' basement. You know? They tried working, and the jobs they could get, they didn't like. And sometimes the parents say, oh, well, you can just stay with us. Well, that doesn't work out very well a lot of times. Okay? Now, it's in the candy now. Okay, we've got all these edibles, and now that it's legal, I mean, they're going hog wild to make sure that it appeals to children, you know, and so we got all kinds of things. It comes in mints, chocolate, suckers. And the THC content, it's not unusual to be between 16% and 46% THC in these edibles. And it does go to the brain, big time. Okay? So that's all we need. We already have a diabetes and obesity epidemic, so candy's already popular. So mixing candy and marijuana together, what's the worst that could happen, you know? I mean, seriously. I mean, you eat a few of these babies, and the thing is that, you know, again, tolerance is not our friend. You think, well, they're just a kid, how much can they use? If you start out with a little bit and you start liking that high, children don't have the most self-control. And they pretty soon, they're liking 90 milligrams a day, okay? I mean, the future is not looking very good if we got a lot of people walking around who've been exposed to massive doses of THC during their formative years. Okay. Now, why do we, and the other thing, I mentioned that or the endocannabinoid system is responsible for brain maturation. The big reason that it gives us pleasure, why is it associated with pleasure? That is because of the food reward system. The endocannabinoid system is very big when it comes to making us eat. The brain likes sugar, and when your blood sugar is low, it will pay you to eat sugar, okay? So, you notice how if you after dinner and you're given some chocolate cake, you're already full. Your blood sugar is already pretty elevated. And so the chocolate cake is not that appealing. Now, if you were to measure your cerebrospinal fluid levels of anandamide, they'd be very low. Because your blood sugar is high, you have low anandamide levels. Now, what does anandamide do? Anandamide causes, in high amounts, binds that receptor and increases the amount of dopamine release at the nucleus accumbens, your reward center. Okay? So the lower your blood sugar, the bigger the anandamide release. And when that happens, if you have low blood sugar and then you eat a piece of cake, now you're getting a buzz from it. Okay? A lot of our depressed patients find a cure for their depression between 11 o'clock and 11 o'clock at night and 1 in the morning. Okay? They find that binge eating then gives them a nice little buzz. That's kind of a marijuana high. Okay? When your blood sugar is low and you binge on sweets, the anandamide levels are very high because of that low blood sugar, and it will give you a buzz. Okay? Which is very similar to the marijuana buzz. But that's why marijuana gives people that feeling, because it binds to those same receptors and gives them that pleasure without having to eat the chocolate cake. Now, for some people, it reminds them of eating so much. They smoke a joint and then eat the cake. And some people, they don't eat because they feel satisfied. All right, so it varies. So some people gain weight on marijuana, some people don't. So marijuana is 500 chemicals, as I mentioned. We talk mostly about THC. Now a word about CBD. CBD actually undoes many of the damaging effects of THC. Okay? THC binds to the cannabis 1 receptor and causes the euphoria, relaxation, anxiety, memory impairment, and paranoia, and so forth. But cannabidiol binds to that receptor and it decreases the negative effects of the THC. It actually displaces THC from the receptor. So cannabidiol comes in and it blocks it, so THC can't do that. And so it helps prevent the toxicity that you see with THC. So if you go back to the marijuana from 1970 or 1960 to 1982, with a 1-to-1 ratio of CBD to THC, the CBD was actually preventing the activity of the THC. So why do they not want that today? Because they don't want CBD to displace it. They want the buzz. They want to maximize the high. And so you want the percentage of THC to be very, very high so that you guarantee the buzz. Okay? But CBD decreases the negative side. Decreased anxiety, decreased memory impairment, as we saw earlier. Okay? So, in cannabis with a low CBD content like we have today, you have a higher risk of hallucinations and delusions, an earlier age of onset of your psychotic disorder, higher risk of acute memory impairment, increased anxiety and paranoia with that amygdala activity. That's today's marijuana. Now, with the older marijuana with the high CBD content, you had a lower risk of hallucinations, delusions, a later age of onset of psychotic illness, a lower risk of memory impairment. Okay? So, in CBD alone possibly has antipsychotic effects, and it does have anti-anxiety effects and perhaps some antidepressant effects as well. So CBD is actually good. I don't have any problem with cannabidiol. And it doesn't have to come from marijuana. Most of the cannabidiol comes from hemp. Hemp is what you make rope out of, and it's a cousin to marijuana, but it doesn't have a bunch of THC in it. And so actually there are quite a few benefits to CBD. All right. Cannabidiol induces rapid and sustained antidepressant-like effects because it increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And when we give somebody an antidepressant, and how long before their serotonin levels go up? It's pretty quick. Serotonin levels go up pretty quick. However, they don't get better really quick. It takes 14 to 21 days, sometimes a month and a half, depending on their genetics, before they start getting better. So what we've discovered is that there are mood changes when neuroplasticity goes up. So it's the neuroplasticity that is making them better, not the change in serotonin. Okay, so neuroplasticity, there are 3 arms to neuroplasticity. 1, increase neurogenesis, the genesis of new neurons in the dentate nucleus of the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex. 2, and the biggest factor, increase synaptogenesis. You increase the number of synapses per neuron. And the 3rd one is increase excretion of waste products like glutamate. So those are measures of neuroplasticity. And when those are occurring, that's when the patient's mood starts to improve. Okay, and so what we have with CBD is something that increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor and therefore increases spine density, in other words, increasing neurogenesis and synaptogenesis. Okay? So CBD does have some antidepressant effects.
Dendrites play an important role in communication by receiving and transmitting signals from other brain cells. Dendrites grow as cells adapt and respond to new information. Patterns vary between cells, but most dendrites grow 4 to 5 branches at a time. A growth cone at the tip of the dendrite expands when calcium is released and is trimmed back as the cell matures. Once spines have grown on the newly formed dendrite, axons from neighboring cells branch and synapse with the spines. Growth of dendrites occurs across the lifespan, but tends to decrease with age.
So I wanted to give you that picture, and you saw those snaky things attaching to the neuron. Well, the more complex, the more dendrites per neuron, the higher the functioning of the brain, the more mood regulation the patient has. That's what, see, when your logical brain increases spine density, increases synaptogenesis, that allows you to override your emotional brain. Okay, that allows you to do problem solving more efficiently, and that's where your mood gets better. And so again, CBD increases synaptogenesis by increasing brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Okay? All right, cannabidiol enhancement of serotonergic and glutamatergic signaling in a mouse model of depression. So again, what they showed here is not just increased synaptogenesis, but the increased release of glutamate. So 2 of the 3 arms of neuroplasticity. All right. Now, we saw this Bhattacharya paper earlier looking at the opposite effects of THC versus cannabidiol. And once again, just to remind you what we saw is that in the prefrontal cortex, what did THC do? Increase or decrease? Decreased. That's where the cognitive issues. And CBD increased. And in the amygdala, the opposite. THC increased it and CBD decreased it. So big change here. So anyway, you get the idea. It's not just for that, also other areas of the brain involved in learning and memory. The CBD actually improved it. So, you know, when it comes to cognitive tasks, emotional regulation, and so forth, CBD is very different than THC. You know, here we look, this is something we saw earlier. With THC, you're looking at increased paranoia, increased anxiety, but with CBD, it actually causes increased relaxation. All right, it causes a more placid affect. So some effects on anxiety there. So opposite effects. So this is basically showing differences in auditory and visual processing. THC reduced auditory and visual processing. CBD did the opposite. So cognitively and emotionally, CBD caused improvements, whereas THC did the opposite. Okay? It's kind of overkill, but I just wanted you to, I mean, CBD has a lot of benefits, okay, and I haven't found anything suggesting any toxicity. So, I mean, it's very good. And it's important to know that, because when we tell people our concerns about marijuana, I found that if we start off talking about, CBD is actually pretty good, because they're confused. They've gone to the internet, they've listened to their friends, and all they hear about is how medical it is and how it can be used for anything. And so we could say, you know what, there's some truth to that. And let's talk about the CBD, okay? And I can say that without reservation. I'm not worried in the slightest if they want to use CBD. Doesn't bother me in any way. As long as they don't go into the dispensary and getting something that's, 2 parts THC, and no, I don't want any THC. So I want to make sure that I stress to them, THC is toxic. You're here to be treated for your mental condition. Okay, THC is going to make it across the board worse. Worse for your mood, worse for your cognition, worse for your health overall. I mean, it's going to cost you millions of dollars in Los Angeles. I mean, just the list goes on and on. I have nothing nice to say about THC, okay? But CBD, that's cool. I have no problem with it. And what you've done when you present it that way, it shows that you're not just coming out and saying, well, don't use it because it's bad for you. You're explaining, why did you hear it was good for you? Well, because CBD is good for you. Okay, but THC is the opposite. All right. So CBD may be helpful even for treating certain types of chronic pain and so forth. So, I mean, according to a report from the World Health Organization, in humans, CBD exhibits no effects indicative of any abuse or dependence potential. To date, there is no evidence of public health-related problems associated with the use of pure CBD. Okay? All right, so, it has antidepressant-like effects. It enhances serotonin and glutamate release. It also acts as a partial agonist for the 5-HT1A. You might know what the 5-HT1A receptor is? No. That's the serotonin. When you give people an antidepressant, you want to increase serotonin because you want to increase the binding at the 5-HT1A receptor. That's the receptor associated with the improved mood. So CBD actually acts as an agonist at that site and directly affects that. So it not only increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, it binds to the 5-HT1A receptor as a partial agonist. So again, explains why it does seem to have antidepressant-like effects. All right, and here you see here that the amount of CBD in marijuana has gone down. So today's marijuana, high in THC and low in CBD. All right. All right, so I think that pretty much summarizes it. I mean, or sums it up rather. Any questions? Yeah.
CBD, does that come from? I don't understand hemp.
Hemp is what we make. You make a rope from it. It's related to the marijuana plant. It's related to sativa, but it's not. I mean, it's in that same family though. But it doesn't have the amounts of THC are so low as to be negligible, and so you can use that and isolate CBD from that, and you don't have to worry about people getting high from it. I mean, you get the benefits of the CBD without the THC. Okay, so hemp is a related plant to marijuana, but it doesn't have the THC that marijuana has. Yeah.
So just so I have as much ammunition as I can when I have to talk to these teenagers who can talk you under the table.
Yeah.
So my teenager's friend is growing it in their garage.
Of course,
right?
yeah.
And so it's perfectly natural and it can't possibly be genetically altered, right?
Yeah, like the seeds he got were from 1975, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he got it from an Egyptian pyramid. Yeah.
It's really, really good. Yeah. That was it.
Oh, okay.
It's the seeds that it produces.
So can you still get those? I mean, could you get a strain from 1975 to get hunted around? Or you went to a dispensary?
It might be.
and said,
It
"Listen,
might,
I want
yeah.
some old stuff."
It's possible. It's possible. Yeah.
So if there's a teen that smokes for a certain amount of time, not consistently even, but socially, like this, let's say this happens, with their clients, we hear about it all the time. Like if it's between years 16 and 18, or between years, does the brain and the
amygdala?
No, the
amygdala.
Yes.
The what?
What did you say?
Anandamide. Oh, okay, gotcha. Yeah, right.
Do they start to work and they're unblocked at that point? So then brain catches up where
yeah. Once you stop, it's unblocked. Yes.
It's unblocked, and but you have to start. Then you're 16 again, and you're 18.
Well, yeah, you pick up from where you left off. The development that would have taken place during that gap period, that's gone. You can't get that back. Yeah, yeah. But once you stop, it'll pick up. But you picked up. Yeah, you're 2 years behind. Yes. Well, you guys 3 years at the time. Who was first? I don't know. I think you might have been first.
I think I was last.
Oh, okay. All right.
I just wondered, so if you took CBD oil with an antidepressant, would that?
Well, it's not approved for that use, but based on what we're seeing here, there is that is a conceivable treatment. Yeah, yes, it would be worth trying in difficult cases. Somebody back here, yeah.
This is an anecdotal story. My cousin, who's my age,
Mm-hmm.
who has autoimmune issues, claims that that marijuana is a good thing. I mean, this really surprised me. So she wanted me to read a book about it, but I didn't do that. But she touts the Ann Arbor dispensary as being just wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
So I think she meant clean and right.
Yes, right. Yes.
Is there any way is there any credibility to, I mean, how do you find out how much THC is in what you use?
Well, sometimes they'll tell you the percentages, and some of the dispensaries, if you ask what percent is this, and they'll tell you it's at 18 or 24 or 38 or whatever. And so, and you also with the name of the strain, you can look it up on the internet, and to get some idea as to what's in it. And so that's how they're marketing it. And so that's the difference. And so they will, so that they sometimes will actually let you know what percentage it is.
Do you know if the new laws are going to require that?
Right now, at this point, I don't know. They just seem to open the door wide open, because right now we're looking at, that's what that guy at the beginning, Schumer, I think, that's what he was talking about, is decriminalizing at the federal level, and just saying, just across the board. Yeah.
CBD with adolescents, any work done on that?
Basically, it works regardless of age in terms of the positive effects. It displaces THC, increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor. In terms of clinical trials specifically looking at adolescents and CBD, I'm not aware of any studies specifically targeted at adolescents, though.
They don't have anything that really points toward it being harmful.
No. So far, there is nothing harmful. No, there are no harmful effects. Yeah.
Do you know any good websites that have this kind of reviews now in a summary way, like handouts?
That does everything I just did? Yeah. Not yet. No. The thing is that because a lot of the data that's really hard does come from functional neuroimaging stuff, there aren't many specialists who are outside of the field, and so radiologists or people who do neuroradiology don't know that much about psychiatry, and people who know about psychiatry rarely know much about brain anatomy from functional neuroimaging perspective. So the problem is that in order to put it together, you need to understand the strength of the evidence, and there's not a lot of people that do that. Okay. Yeah.
What would be chronic marijuana usage and regular marijuana usage? I mean, it sounds like a lot of the studies you talked about.
Yeah, chronic is at least 4 to 5 times a week. No, that's heavy. I should have said that's heavy usage. Chronic usage is if you keep using it, long term. So that's even once a week. It's chronic. Yeah.
Would regular be daily?
Yeah, that's definitely a daily use. That'd be chronic. If you're using it constantly. So yeah.
So have they done any effect on the heavy cannabis use with older people? We know that it's terrible, like with alcohol for younger people. What effect on older populations?
In terms of specific cannabis effects on geriatric populations, that has not been done. That's kind of one of the things that they alluded to in the NIH study, is that we don't have that. Nobody's looked at that subpopulation. And again, the problem before was the fact that it was illegal, and so trying to when you have something that is listed right along with heroin, you can't do studies on it. But now we can. But again. Trying to, having one group, I have a problem with people that are already susceptible to dementia, and then giving them an agent that is known to be neurotoxic. Ethically speaking, that's a rough study to do. Okay, I mean, I would be nervous about that. Yeah.
So if women are pregnant and they smoke marijuana, and they give birth to children that have have a hard time with working memory, motivation, and mood regulation, Is it safe for us to assume that most of the politicians in Washington had pot smoking?
Yeah, well, you know, I think that's an assumption that...
No,
yeah.
they're making too much money.
Oh, it's the sugar.
So you said that the amygdala is activated basically each time is 90 milligrams.
Yeah, that's going to be shining like the sun.
Right.
Basically, the amount of dopamine at the amygdala is going to be very high, and it's going to stay high. Yes, yeah.
So once you stop, does the amygdala reset?
Eventually, it takes a long time, because the half-life of THC is just so long. But yeah, eventually it does go back to baseline. Yeah.
So I know someone who uses, smoke marijuana every day. They say it's the only thing that helps this pain issue that they have.
Mm-hmm.
And they're also having anxiety, paranoia.
Sure.
They also want treatment for. So if that's the case, are they just lying that that's the only thing that helps, or would you recommend?
Well, no, it's like somebody says, I have this pain, but I have this arthritis. It's very similar to this. Alcohol blocks prostaglandin E2, which is important for joint remodeling, and so it helps you make hyaline cartilage so that when you move your joints, it helps repair the potholes. If you drink alcohol, it prevents that, and so your arthritis is going to get worse. So what happens with many people who drink alcohol is that they have arthritis pain, they drink some vodka, the pain goes away, but now the joint is further eroded. It's the same idea. You smoke the joint, the immediate effect is that food reward system gets activated, and you have a happy on, and that blocks the pain. All right? But guess what? You just made your anxiety much worse. Short-term benefits, but long-term, it's like putting out a fire with kerosene. It'll go out for a minute, okay? But when it comes back, all right, it's the same idea.
Would you recommend that they just try,
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But they're going to say they're not going to get the high, and it's probably not going to be satisfying because they've developed a tolerance, and that now they got to go through withdrawal. Okay, and so sometimes I will use a number of things for the withdrawal. One of the things I use a lot of is gabapentin to help some of the anxiety. But they just made that a scheduled medicine. See that crazy that is? They make gabapentin a schedule at this, and then they unlock marijuana. It's like, you people just get out of the business. You guys shouldn't regulate anything. I mean, how stupid is this? You take something that blocks brain maturation and something that doesn't kill anybody. I mean, it's like, come on, and you make that a scheduled medicine. Nobody's in charge here. Jeez. Anyway. Yeah.
Is there an optimal way, a more optimal way to take CBD, like pills versus oil?
Yeah, as long as it's getting in there. Ultimately, it's going to do the same thing. So, yeah, there's no optimal. I mean, as long as it's ingested somehow, yeah.
So this might sound like a stupid question, but a lot of kids do this because it's a social thing, too.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just the high. I mean, the high is there, obviously.
Yeah.
So if a kid is going to make that argument that, my friends do it, and it's just something I'll do when we hang out,
Mm-hmm. I've heard that before.
Is it, I wouldn't give this advice, but I want to know if it's a truism that you said, well, if you're going to do it, do something with as low amount of THC as possible?
And as high of CBD, yeah. I mean, if you have to choose the lesser of the evils, I'd rather. That's why I explain to them. I explain what it does. Like, look, you keep using it, and how often do you use it? Because when people tell you, I only use it once a month, then that means once a week. A lot of times. So, yeah. And keep in mind, 1 in 5. I mean, people smoke it, but it's like 1 in 5 end up using every day. It's pretty addictive, especially when you're talking about adolescents who are impulsive to start with and more prone to substance use. I mean, you guys are taking a big risk here. I mean, this is something, again, we're talking millions of dollars, and, they lack the insight and judgment a lot of times. So that's why it was helpful to have it illegal, because it gave the children who really didn't want to use it, it gave them some help against the peer pressure. But now you take that away, and now you're going to at least increase the use of marijuana by double in the schools. I mean, I can guarantee you it's going to at least double, at least. Okay?
There's a lot of arguments with how addictive it really is, right? Because there's not the physical dependency.
Oh, there is. There is physical dependency.
And you also said withdrawal,
absolutely.
and I didn't know that.
Oh, yes, there's physical dependency and withdrawal. Absolutely.
What is the withdrawal? Like what?
It can be a restlessness, headache, craving, insomnia.
Emotional withdrawal. cholesterol for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
And I knew that.
And the thing is that, you know, when you feel stressed, and the reason that cigarettes are so addictive is because they're inhaled. When you inhale a substance, you get a rapid change. Those rapid, remember, the high, the quicker, the more, if you go from this much dopamine to this much dopamine, that's the pleasure part of it. And the inhaled substances are very addictive. Anytime you have a rewarding substance that's inhaled, it's going to be way more addictive than something you put in your mouth.
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah.
So I've seen accessibility be an issue in terms of transferring from THC to CBD.
Mm-hmm.
For example, like if you have someone who is used to getting marijuana on 8 Mile, right? But then you're asking them, to switch to CBD, and then, I've seen it at Fresh Time and Whole Foods, but it's like $100.
That's the problem. You're right. You're absolutely right. CBD is not cheap, and that is. It would be nice if it was, but it's not. And so I would never go to Whole Foods because they're expensive, But I would get it online, I would definitely. I would go to Amazon. Go to Amazon and get it, man, because Whole Foods.
Any recommended resources?
Yeah. Amazon. Amazon's fine. Yeah.
Don't a lot of the CBD oils have a little percentage of THC?
If you get them from a dispensary and they're pulling it out, then I don't recommend the ones you get from the dispensary. I say get it from hemp. Make sure if it's sold on the internet, it's hemp based. So because there's virtually no difference in the molecule. So don't let anybody tell you that hemp based isn't as good. It's CBD is CBD. It's the molecule. It's not different. There's not a hemp CBD and a cannabis CBD. It's the same CBD. It's just when you get it hemp based, you don't have any appreciable amounts of THC.
What are the benefits of taking CBD?
CBD? Increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor, anxiety, depression, intractable. Because what happens, it does increase the excretion of glutamate, which is, there's lots of reasons, so yeah.
I remember back when I was taking a biopsych course, our professor said that his professor had stated back in the day that he thought Prozac was safe enough to put in the drinking water. With the current topic, should CBD be put in the drinking water?
No, it's oil. It won't mix. Plus, you take a whole lot of hemp, man. That's a whole lot of hemp, man. Yeah. But some lithium has some of these as well. But you don't, But I think CBD is actually a little safer than lithium because you take too much lithium, your thyroid and your kidneys can take a hit. But lithium also raises brain-derived neurotrophic factor. But yeah, CBD is actually a bit safer than that. But it'd be expensive in the water. Right. Yeah.
So I think with CBD, I bought some
Mm-hmm.
at the Herb Fest a few years ago, and it didn't have any THC.
Yeah.
I was using it for pain. And
Yeah. Right.
I didn't recall. I mean, it was very expensive.
Yes.
But they had like different percentages, I think.
Of CBD?
Yeah. Do you know if that's true or if that's just a CBD?
If it came from a dispensary, then because you.
This was not a dispensary.
Was it a dispensary? Yeah, I'm not sure about that. Yeah, I couldn't tell you in terms of because I don't see it marketed by percentage because it's either pure CBD or it's not. Yeah.
If you have a client that is looking to stop smoking marijuana but has been a go-ahead user,
Yeah.
would it be beneficial for them to quite motivate?
Yes, because sometimes, there are several things we can do. One is we can do to help with the anxiety part of withdrawal, because what happens is that they've gotten used to at a certain time of the day to chill, and it's like having a beer or a glass of wine, and that's what they do. And so, like to replace it with something else, and gabapentin's pretty safe. Another thing, if they're younger people, the cravings can sometimes be helpful with N-acetylcysteine. After the age of 25, it doesn't appear to be as helpful, but before the age of 25, it does help with the cravings as well. Okay, so there are other things, but yeah, it's just something because anytime you're trying to stop a drug cold turkey, it's kind of nice if you have something to replace it with, at least until their body adjusts to it, because that initial withdrawal is hard, and that leads to relapse very often. Okay.
What did you say? What's
N-acetylcysteine. It's an antioxidant that it's converted into glutathione in the body, which is a powerful antioxidant. And because what happens is that with chronic use, how can I say, THC, it causes a cascade of reactions in your brain, including it increases free radicals. And so N-acetylcysteine drastically reduces that, and it does, for some reason, it helps with the cravings that people have with marijuana if they're under 25.
That's a prescription?
No, it's not a prescription. No, it's over the counter. Yeah, so it's about 1,800 to 2,400 milligrams of N-acetylcysteine a day. Okay, but for people over the 25, it hasn't been shown to be helpful. But under 25, it's pretty useful. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
Earlier you mentioned about there is a theory how pot smoking is good for ALS, Huntington disease.
No. Now CBD, because of its effect on brain-derived neurotrophic factor, can be useful. You know, it hasn't been completely validated yet. We need more studies. But for as far as marijuana smoking, no. The problem is this: you have people with those conditions who smoke marijuana and say, you know, I feel better. And it's like, well, you know, vodka works too, but long term, is it affecting your illness? And the thing is that there is no double blind. You guys you like pot and you smoke it and it makes you feel a little better, but you haven't demonstrated that it makes the condition better. We don't have any good studies to show that. Okay, so, and again, it's with the problem again with the placebo. To prove that, if you're talking about pot smoking and you want to prove that it's effective, we need a placebo that smells as bad as the original thing. And see, that's the hard thing about getting a study like that. So there may be a benefit, but we can't demonstrate it without those kinds of studies.
So for the client who said that he is smoking pot for the reason of Huntington disease.
Yeah. My thing is that you probably are going to make it worse. Because Huntington's disease, ultimately you end up with that Huntington's delirium, Huntington's hallucinations and delusions. And what do you see there? Oh, increased dopamine at the amygdala. And so you're smoking weed, and you're on your way pretty quick there. You're actually accelerating the process. So, you know, it's like drinking vodka to feel a little better. Yeah, short term, you might feel better, but in the long run, this is going to bite you. Okay? And so from a mechanistically, that's a bad idea, in my opinion. That's a very bad idea. So you can do it. It's legal. But if you expect that you're going to get away with it, you're smoking dope. Yeah.
Dr. Guy, do you have an interest in creating this presentation for parents and teenagers and schools? And if not, why?
Well, you know, I've done, yeah.
Because this is
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
the type of information that
Mhm.
they're getting.
I know,
Right?
yeah.
And I'm going to put it out there. I think if
Mhm.
you were able to reach every single
Yeah,
parent, and every single teenager and provided this information in
Sure.
a way that they could understand, you might change, what do you guys think, 75% of their brains.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do it.
Reached out to every single
Yeah.
person out there.
Yeah, you know, the one thing, because when I do programs like this for schools, you know, and what always amazes me is that when I do them, the parents that show up are the ones that don't need any help. You know, I see this all the time. So yes, I'm very happy to do it, but the people come in, the responsible parents with their notebooks and everything, and they sit down, and the ones that should be there, nowhere to be found. Yeah, they're home smoking weed, you know.
What we need to do is when they send their kids in here, we need to require them.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. There you go. There you go.
You need an agent to start marketing.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Sounds good, yeah. Yeah.
Dr. Guy, are you okay with us as clinicians recommending things we know you've said over the counter? Like
Yeah.
over-
Yeah, no problem. No problem.
I'm like,
Yeah.
really good.
Yeah.
Can you say it again? That was really good.
It was, as clinicians, is he okay with us recommending things that can be bought over the counter, like holy basil and what you just indicated for the withdrawal symptoms? And he said yes, because I always get nervous. Oh, I saw Dr. Guy,
Yeah.
like in his assessment.
Yeah.
He said this is available, you know.
Yeah. Some things they're not going to hurt anybody. You know,
I would
fish
be
oil and stuff.
careful giving medical advice though
Oh,
on your
yeah.
license. That's the biggest
That's the
thing you
biggest
have to be
thing.
careful.
Yeah.
What about recommending seeds?
It's not going to, I mean, the thing is, the main thing is the cost. I mean, in terms of the effects of it, there's nothing, you know, it's a simple molecule and it's not doing anything bad. And from what we're seeing, it's doing a lot of things very good. So. Yeah. Yeah.
What's the cost? You mentioned that it's really the neuroplasticity that improves mood.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So when you give someone an antidepressant,
Mhm.
serotonin,
Yeah, ultimately it results in it improves. Ultimately, it improves neuroplasticity when you when you increase serotonin levels. Those ultimately bind to the 5-HT1A receptor, which leads to a cascade of events, which ultimately increase neuroplasticity. It takes anywhere from 7 to 21 days for the average person, and some people longer for that to take place.
so then why, like, some people need, if I'm correct, like Cymbalta isn't just serotonin, it's
Yeah, that's norepinephrine too. Yeah.
so why do some people need
Well, because whenever if I use a norepinephrine agent, those are people very often who have very low motivation, low energy levels, low levels of alertness, okay, or chronic pain issues as well. So the mixed agents help with pain. Okay, so that's the other reason. So if there's low motivation, a low level of awakeness during the day, or an ongoing pain issue, then that's something we can try. Okay? Or if they failed on SSRIs alone, then we can try that too. Okay? All right. Yeah?
When you say this is expensive, the
CBD?
Yeah.
A little bit on the expensive side.
I'm sorry, what, the oil?
The oil, yeah, it is. It is kind. Yeah, I mean, it's for a low dose, it's going to be like $20, $30, and for the high potency stuff, it's over $50. So, yeah, I don't know. Is it that expensive to? Yeah, I don't make this stuff, so I don't know.
Mine was like $90.
$90, yeah. So.
Because it was so expensive.
Yeah.
The advice was a couple of drops at the top at night.
So I would hope that as it becomes more popular, the price would come down. I would hope so. More competition. We'll see. All right.
Can we give Dr. Guy a really warm There was a wait list, so consider yourself lucky that you got in. He's going to be willing to come back for some of our students and colleagues who are not able